In 1957, archaeologists working in a cave in Iraq made a discovery that would fundamentally change how we understand human history. They found a skeleton, nothing unusual there. Caves are full of old bones. But this one was different. This was a Neanderthal who lived 45,000 years ago, and his left arm was missing. Not torn off in an attack, not lost to decay, surgically removed. Someone had amputated his arm at the elbow, and here's the really crazy part. He survived. The bone shows clear signs of healing. This person lived for years after the amputation, long enough for the wound to close, for the bone to reshape itself, for scar tissue to form. Someone cut off his arm with stone tools, no anesthesia, no antibiotics, no sterile operating room, and he didn't die screaming from infection 3 days later. He lived. Which means someone knew what they were doing. Someone understood enough about human anatomy, about blood loss, about infection, about wound care, to perform surgery 45,000 years ago and have the patient survive. Let that sink in for a second. Today, if you get a bad cut, you go to the emergency room. They clean it, stitch it up, give you antibiotics, maybe a tetanus shot. You're home by dinner. We take this for granted. We assume medicine is a modern invention, something that came with hospitals and doctors in white coats and pharmaceutical companies. But that Neanderthal in Iraq tells a different story. He tells us that humans have been healing each other, saving each other from death for hundreds of thousands of years. The question is, how? How did a species with no medical schools, no textbooks, no microscopes, no understanding of germs or viruses or DNA, manage to survive catastrophic injuries for 300,000 years? How did they know to amputate an infected limb before sepsis killed the whole person? How did they discover which plants stopped bleeding and which ones killed pain? How did they figure out that maggots actually clean wounds? Or that mouldy bread could fight infection thousands of years before we discovered penicillin? If you're watching this late at night, perfect. That's literally why I make these. So maybe subscribe and drop a comment telling me where you are and what time it is. I read them all and it's wild. Sydney at sunrise, Seattle at 2 a.m, all watching at once. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to trace the entire history of human healing, from the moment our ancestors first wrapped a leaf around a wound to the moment scientists learned to edit the code of life itself. 300,000 years of medicine. And I'm warning you now, this story is nothing like what you learned in school. You probably think medicine started with the Greeks, right? Hippocrates and all that. Wrong. You probably think the Middle Ages were a medical dead zone. Also wrong. You probably think modern medicine just steadily improved over time, getting better and better. Completely wrong. The real story is stranger, darker, and infinitely more fascinating. It's full of accidental discoveries, brilliant insights, catastrophic mistakes, and moments of pure courage that changed everything. It's about the plague doctor who wore a bird mask filled with flowers, the Chinese surgeon who invented anesthesia 1,600 years before Europe, the women healers who were burned as witches for knowing too much, the doctor who drank cholera-infected water to prove his theory, the moment humans first looked inside a living body without cutting it open. This is the story of humanity's longest war, not against other humans, but against death itself. And we're winning. When our ancestors lived in caves, the average human died before age 30. Today, we're pushing past 80 in many countries. We've doubled human lifespan. We've eliminated diseases that killed millions. We've learned to transplant hearts, replace joints, cure cancers, restore sight to the blind. But it didn't start in a laboratory. It started with a wound, and someone who refused to let another human die. Let's begin at the beginning, when healing was humanity's first science. Back when the only tool was observation, the only laboratory was the human body, and the only teacher was survival itself. Before there were doctors, before there were hospitals, before there was anything we'd recognize as organized medicine, there was something more fundamental. There was compassion. And we know this because of a skeleton found in Dmanisi, Georgia. It's 1.77 million years old, belonging to an elderly Homo erectus. And it tells a story that changes everything we thought we knew about when humans started caring for each other. This individual had lost all their teeth years before they died. Not days before, not weeks before, years. In the prehistoric world, losing your teeth was essentially a death sentence. You couldn't process food. You couldn't survive. Except this person did survive, for years. Which means someone was caring for them. Someone was pre-chewing their food, protecting them, keeping them alive when natural selection said they should have died. This wasn't a modern human doing this. Homo sapiens wouldn't exist for another 1.5 million years. This was a completely different species, and they had already figured out the most important principle of medicine, that sometimes survival isn't about being the fittest, it's about being cared for. Fast forward to 800,000 years ago. Remember those Neanderthals we talked about? The ones who evolved in Ice Age Europe? They weren't just surviving the cold, they were developing medicine. We know this because of teeth. Neanderthal teeth, to be specific. When archaeologists analysed the calcified plaque on Neanderthal dental remains from sites across Europe, they found something extraordinary. Chemical residues from yarrow and chamomile. Now here's the thing, yarrow and chamomile taste absolutely terrible. They're bitter, unpleasant, nutritionally worthless. There's no reason to eat them unless you know something, unless you understand they have medicinal properties. Yarrow reduces inflammation and helps blood clot. Chamomile has mild sedative effects and can ease digestive problems. The Neanderthals weren't just randomly chewing on plants, they were self-medicating. They had figured out herbal medicine, but it gets even more fascinating. At one site in Spain, archaeologists found Neanderthal remains with evidence of a serious jaw infection, the kind of infection that would have been agonizing, potentially fatal. Analysis of the teeth showed they had been consuming poplar bark, which contains salicylic acid, the active ingredient in aspirin. They were treating pain with what we would now recognize as a legitimate analgesic. These weren't modern humans. These were our evolutionary cousins, separated from us by hundreds of thousands of years of independent evolution. And they had figured out pharmacology. So had the Denisovans, apparently. Genetic analysis of modern Tibetan populations shows they inherited variants from Denisovans that help process certain plant alkaloids. The only way those variants would have been selected for is if Denisovan populations were regularly consuming plants containing those alkaloids. Medicinal plants. Probably the kind used to treat altitude sickness, respiratory problems, and other conditions common in high-altitude environments. They had developed an entire pharmacopoeia adapted to their specific environment. And they did it without laboratories, without clinical trials, without any of the infrastructure we associate with drug development. They did it through observation, experimentation, and probably a lot of trial and error that killed people before finding what worked. But prehistoric medicine wasn't just about plants. It was about something far more dramatic, something that sounds absolutely insane until you see the evidence. They were performing brain surgery. In 1965, archaeologists in France discovered a skull from approximately 7,000 years ago. Nothing unusual about that. Prehistoric skulls turn up all the time. But this skull had a perfectly circular hole drilled into it, about 2 inches in diameter, clean edges, and here's the crucial detail. The bone around the hole showed signs of healing. This person didn't die during the procedure. They survived. Weeks, maybe months afterward. Someone had drilled a hole in a living person's skull and that person had lived. This procedure is called trepanation, and it's the oldest surgery we have clear evidence for. Trepanned skulls have been found on every continent except Antarctica, dating back as far as 10,000 years. Some skulls show evidence of multiple trepanations, meaning people survived the first procedure and came back for another. But why? Why would prehistoric humans drill holes in living skulls? We're not entirely sure, but the evidence suggests several possibilities. Some trepanned skulls show signs of head trauma nearby, suggesting doctors were relieving pressure from skull fractures or internal bleeding. Others show no signs of injury, suggesting the procedure might have been performed for psychological conditions. Migraines, epilepsy, mental illness, conditions that ancient peoples might have attributed to evil spirits trapped in the skull. The survival rate was shockingly high. Analysis of trepanned skulls from Neolithic Europe shows about 50% survived the procedure. That's better than many surgical procedures in the 19th century, before antiseptics and anesthesia. How did they do it? We don't know exactly, but we can make educated guesses. They use flint tools, incredibly sharp, capable of cutting bone without crushing it. They probably worked slowly over hours or days, cutting through the outer layer of skull, then the inner layer, carefully avoiding the brain tissue beneath. They must have had some way of managing infection, probably plant-based antiseptics. Analysis of some trepanned skulls shows residues consistent with tree resins which have genuine antimicrobial properties, and they must have had some way of managing pain. Which brings us to one of the great mysteries of prehistoric medicine. How did they deal with pain? We know they did surgery. We know they set broken bones. Archaeological evidence shows healed fractures that were clearly set and splintered. Bones that would have been excruciatingly painful to manipulate. We found evidence of amputations that healed successfully. How did they get patients to hold still through that kind of agony? The answer seems to be a combination of techniques, some pharmaceutical, some psychological. Chemical analysis of prehistoric sites has turned up residues from opium poppies, cannabis, and various hallucinogenic plants. These weren't food sources. They were being cultivated or collected deliberately, probably for their psychoactive properties. But there's also evidence for fermentation. Clay vessels from prehistoric sites show residues consistent with fermented honey, fruits, and grains. Alcohol in various forms, not just for recreation, but for medical purposes. Get someone drunk enough and you can set their broken leg while they're too intoxicated to fight back. Brutal, but effective. There's also evidence for more sophisticated pain management. Some prehistoric cultures developed what we might call hypnotic techniques. Rhythmic chanting, drumming, focused breathing. These practices are documented in later shamanic traditions, but probably have much older roots. Modern research on hypnosis shows it can genuinely reduce pain perception, sometimes dramatically. Prehistoric peoples might have stumbled onto this through trial and error. Speaking of shamans, we need to talk about who exactly was doing all this healing. The archaeological evidence points to specialized individuals, people who dedicated themselves to understanding the body, plants, injuries, and diseases. The earliest healers were probably women. We know this from several lines of evidence. First, burial sites from prehistoric periods occasionally include individuals buried with unusual grave goods, collections of healing plants, specialized tools, objects that suggest ritual or medical significance. When we can determine the sex of these skeletons, they're often female. Second, ethnographic studies of hunter-gatherer societies that survived into the modern era show that women typically hold specialized knowledge about medicinal plants, childbirth, and child-rearing practices. This makes evolutionary sense. Women were the primary gatherers in most prehistoric societies, giving them more exposure to plants and more opportunities to discover their properties. But there were male healers too, particularly for traumatic injuries. The bone setting, the trepanation, the treatment of wounds from hunting or warfare. These seem to have been more commonly performed by men, though the evidence isn't clear-cut. What is clear is that healing became a specialized role. Not everyone in the tribe was expected to know how to set bones or identify medicinal plants. That knowledge was concentrated in specific individuals who probably spent years learning from their predecessors. This created the first medical lineages. Knowledge passed down from mentor to apprentice, accumulated over generations. When a skilled healer died, the tribe didn't just lose one person. They lost decades of accumulated experience and knowledge. This created strong incentive to formalize teaching, to develop ways of preserving and transmitting medical knowledge. We have evidence for some of this transmission. Cave paintings from France and Spain, dating back 20,000 years or more, include what appear to be anatomical diagrams, images of human figures with internal organs marked, with points on the body highlighted. These might be the world's first medical illustrations, teaching tools used to train new healers. Some researchers think they might even represent early versions of acupuncture or pressure point therapy, though that's controversial. What's not controversial is that Ice Age humans were dealing with brutal medical challenges. Frostbite was probably common, especially among Neanderthal populations living through glacial periods. We have skeletal evidence of frostbite injuries that healed, suggesting people survived severe cases. How? Probably through careful warming, protection of damaged tissue, and prevention of infection. They might have used animal fats to protect exposed skin, insulated frostbitten limbs with fur and moss, and treated subsequent infections with antimicrobial plant preparations. Infections themselves were a constant threat. Any cut, any wound, any broken bone could become infected and turn fatal. Prehistoric healers must have developed protocols for wound care. We know they cleaned wounds, probably with water, possibly with plant preparations. We know they had ways of closing wounds. Analysis of some prehistoric remains shows evidence of suturing, wounds held together with plant fibers or animal sinew. The technique is crude by modern standards, but demonstrates understanding of a basic surgical principle. Get the edges of a wound close together and the body will heal it. They also developed antiseptics, not antibiotics, which require industrial chemistry, but substances that could kill or slow bacterial growth. Tree resins, particularly from conifers, contain compounds that are genuinely antimicrobial. Honey has antimicrobial properties and has been found in contexts suggesting medicinal use. Some plants produce compounds that inhibit bacterial growth. Prehistoric healers wouldn't have understood germ theory, wouldn't have known they were killing bacteria, but they would have noticed that certain treatments reduced the red, swollen, painful infections that killed so many patients. Then there was childbirth. Pregnancy and delivery were among the most dangerous events in a prehistoric woman's life. No modern obstetrics, no caesarean sections, no blood transfusions. If something went wrong, mother and child could both die. But humans evolved some advantages. Unlike most primates, human females often assist each other during labour. This tradition probably goes back hundreds of thousands of years. Experienced women would help during delivery, using knowledge accumulated over generations. We know from later historical records that certain positions, massage techniques, and herbal preparations could ease labour and reduce complications. Prehistoric midwives probably discovered many of the same techniques through experience. For complications, the options were limited but not non-existent. If labour stalled, healers might have used positioning changes or manual manipulation. Some plant preparations can stimulate contractions. For hemorrhaging after delivery, they probably used plant-based astringents and direct pressure. For breech births or other severe complications, survival rates would have been low. But the fact that our species survived means enough women survived childbirth to maintain the population. Those survival skills, that accumulated obstetric knowledge, was as crucial as any other prehistoric technology. Then everything changed. Around 12,000 years ago, humans began transitioning from nomadic hunter-gatherers to settled agricultural societies. This transition, which we call the Neolithic Revolution, was one of the most important events in human history. It allowed population growth, technological development, and eventually civilization. But it also created a medical catastrophe. Agricultural peoples lived in permanent settlements in close quarters, often with domestic animals. This created perfect conditions for disease transmission. Diseases that had been rare among scattered nomadic bands became epidemic. Measles, smallpox, influenza, tuberculosis. These emerged as major killers after the agricultural transition. Settled agriculture also changed human diet, often for the worse. Skeletal remains from early agricultural societies show increased rates of malnutrition, dental disease, and growth stunting compared to hunter-gatherer populations. People were eating less diverse diets, more dependent on a few staple crops. When those crops failed, famine followed. The archaeological record from this transition period shows declining health by almost every measurable standard. People got shorter, died younger, suffered more disease, but they also started developing new medical responses. Larger settled populations meant more healers, more specialization. Knowledge that had been transmitted orally could now be written down. The first written medical texts would emerge from these early agricultural civilizations. Medicine as an organized discipline was about to be born. But that foundation, those hundreds of thousands of years of accumulated knowledge about healing plants, setting bones, treating wounds, managing pain, all of that came from the prehistoric period. From Homo erectus caring for toothless elders, from Neanderthals chewing medicinal plants, from anonymous healers performing brain surgery with flint tools, from midwives helping women through childbirth, from shamans combining practical medicine with spiritual care. They didn't have science as we understand it. They had observation, experimentation, accumulated experience, and something equally important. They had compassion, the knowledge that suffering should be relieved when possible, that the sick should be cared for, that healing is worth the effort even when success isn't guaranteed. That's the real foundation of medicine. Not technology, not science, compassion. Everything else, all the incredible advances we'll explore in the centuries to come, all of it builds on that fundamental prehistoric insight, that we heal because we care, because we're human, and that makes all the difference. Something extraordinary happened around 10,000 BCE. Humans stopped running. For hundreds of thousands of years, our ancestors had been nomadic, following animal herds, tracking seasonal plants, never staying in one place long enough to accumulate much beyond what they could carry. Then, almost simultaneously in several regions across the world, people started settling down. They domesticated wheat in the Fertile Crescent, rice in China, maize in Mesoamerica. They built permanent structures, stored surplus food, created pottery to hold it. Population densities that would have been unthinkable for hunter-gatherers became the new normal. And with those dense populations came something humans had never really experienced before on such a scale: epidemic disease. Living in close quarters with domesticated animals, drinking from communal water sources, disposing of waste in increasingly crowded settlements, early agricultural societies created perfect breeding grounds for pathogens. Diseases that had occasionally affected small nomadic bands now swept through entire communities. Tuberculosis, probably jumping from cattle, measles from sheep or goats, influenza from pigs and birds, smallpox, possibly from camels or rodents. The fossil record from early agricultural sites tells a brutal story. Average human height decreased by several inches as nutrition declined and disease increased. Life expectancy dropped. Skeletal remains show evidence of infections, malnutrition, and epidemic diseases that would have been rare among scattered hunter-gatherers. But here's the incredible part. Humans adapted. Not just biologically, though, that happened too, but culturally. They developed medicine. Not the intuitive wound care and herb knowledge of their prehistoric ancestors, but systematic approaches to understanding and treating disease. They started writing things down. Around 2500 BCE in ancient Mesopotamia, someone pressed a reed stylus into soft clay and recorded what might be humanity's first written medical prescription. The tablet, discovered thousands of years later in what is now Iraq, contains recipes for treating various ailments. It lists ingredients, plant extracts, mineral compounds, animal products. It provides mixing instructions, dosages, application methods. This wasn't just folk wisdom passed down orally anymore. This was medicine as a reproducible technology. knowledge that could be preserved, studied, and improved across generations. But what's really wild about these early Mesopotamian tablets is what they reveal about how physicians thought. They weren't just listing remedies, they were documenting diagnostic processes. If the patient has these symptoms, consider these possible causes. If treatment A doesn't work, try treatment B. If the condition worsens, adjust the approach. This is algorithmic thinking applied to medicine, decision trees for dealing with disease. These ancient doctors were developing what we'd now call clinical protocols, standardized approaches based on accumulated experience, and they were keeping records. Archaeological evidence suggests Mesopotamian physicians tracked patient outcomes, noted which treatments worked and which didn't, refined their approaches based on results. This is empiricism, the foundation of scientific medicine, happening 4,500 years ago in mud brick cities along the Tigris and Euphrates. Meanwhile, something even more sophisticated was developing in Egypt. The ancient Egyptians had stumbled into an extraordinary medical education opportunity, though not one they'd chosen: mummification. To preserve bodies for the afterlife, Egyptian embalmers had to remove internal organs carefully, treat tissues with preservatives, understand decay processes. This meant they were doing something almost no other ancient culture did systematically, looking inside the human body. Most ancient peoples considered corpses spiritually dangerous, not to be touched or examined. Egyptian religious beliefs happened to require extensive handling of the dead. This gave Egyptian physicians an anatomical education that would have been shocking in most other societies. They understood that the heart pumped blood. They knew the brain existed, though they thought it was relatively unimportant compared to the heart. They could identify the liver, lungs, intestines, and understood at least roughly what they did. This knowledge shows up in the medical papyri, ancient Egyptian medical texts written on papyrus scrolls. The most famous is the Edwin Smith papyrus, dated to around 1600 BCE, but probably copied from much older sources. This isn't mystical healing, this is systematic surgical medicine. The papyrus describes 48 different traumatic injuries, proceeding methodically from head to toe. For each case, it provides a title describing the injury, an examination procedure to determine severity, a diagnosis, and a treatment plan. Here's what's stunning. The Edwin Smith papyrus recognizes 3 categories of cases: ailments I can treat, ailments I can fight, and ailments I cannot treat. This is medical triage, honest assessment of what's possible. The author doesn't claim to cure everything. He acknowledges limitations, tells physicians when to attempt treatment and when to provide comfort care only. This is ethical medicine, intellectual humility in the face of disease. The surgical treatments described are remarkably advanced: suturing wounds with thread, setting broken bones with splints, treating skull fractures, spinal injuries, dislocated joints. There's even a case describing what we'd now call tetanus, documenting the progression of symptoms with clinical precision. And while the papyrus includes some remedies that wouldn't have worked, many are surprisingly reasonable. Honey for wound treatment, which we now know has antibacterial properties. Willow bark for pain relief, which contains the same compound as aspirin. Mouldy bread on infections, essentially a primitive antibiotic since some moulds produce antimicrobial compounds. But Egyptian medicine had limitations too. It was still mixed with magic and religion. Many treatments involved incantations alongside practical medicine. Physicians believed in spiritual causes for some diseases. Still, the practical knowledge was real and effective enough that Egyptian doctors were famous throughout the ancient world. Foreign rulers requested Egyptian physicians. The knowledge spread. Around the same time Egypt was developing its medical traditions, something equally remarkable was happening in India. The Ayurvedic medical system was emerging from the Vedic traditions, and it was sophisticated in ways that would shock most people today. The foundational Ayurvedic texts, compiled between 800 BCE and 200 CE, describe a comprehensive theory of medicine based on balancing three fundamental bodily humours or doshas, vata, pitta, and kapha. Now, we know this humoral theory isn't accurate in modern biochemical terms, but that's not really the point. The point is that ancient Indian physicians were attempting to create a systematic explanatory framework for health and disease. They were theorizing, testing, refining their models based on observed results, and their practical medicine was extraordinary. The Sushruta Samhita, attributed to the physician Sushruta who lived around 600 BCE, describes over 300 surgical procedures and 120 surgical instruments. This text discusses rhinoplasty, reconstructive surgery to rebuild noses. Why? Because in ancient India certain crimes were punished by cutting off the nose. Sushruta developed techniques using forehead skin flaps to reconstruct functional noses for these individuals. He documented the procedures in detail, including how to prevent infection, manage pain, and care for healing tissues. Read that again. Plastic surgery in 600 BCE. Documented systematic, reproducible techniques for reconstructing facial features. The British surgeons who reinvented rhinoplasty in the 18th century actually learned the technique from Indian practitioners who'd been using Sushruta's methods continuously for over 2,000 years. Indian physicians also developed sophisticated procedures for cataract surgery, using a curved needle to push the clouded lens aside and restore vision. They performed lithotomy, removing bladder stones surgically. They understood the importance of cleanliness, requiring surgeons to bathe, wear clean clothes, and use sterilized instruments. They practiced surgical techniques on clay models, animal tissues, and plants before attempting procedures on humans. This is medical education, systematic training of physicians to develop skill before treating patients. On the other side of the Himalayas, Chinese medicine was developing along different but equally sophisticated lines. By around 200 BCE, physicians in China had developed a comprehensive medical theory based on the concept of qi, life energy flowing through the body along specific pathways called meridians. Illness resulted from blockages or imbalances in qi flow. Treatment involved restoring proper flow through herbs, dietary changes, exercise, and acupuncture. Now the meridian system doesn't correspond to any anatomical structures Western medicine recognizes. There are no physical channels carrying qi that you can dissect and observe. But the treatments developed from this theory worked often enough to be refined and preserved for thousands of years. Acupuncture, inserting fine needles at specific points to influence qi flow, has been tested repeatedly in modern clinical trials. The results are complex. It definitely does something, though exactly what and through what mechanisms remains debated. It's effective for some types of pain, nausea, and other conditions. The theoretical framework might be wrong, but the practical observations that led to developing these techniques captured something real about human physiology. Chinese herbal medicine was even more sophisticated. Ancient Chinese physicians tested thousands of plant substances, mineral compounds, and animal products, documenting their effects in enormous pharmacological texts. The Sheneng Benkao Jing, compiled around 200 CE, describes 365 medicines, categorizing them by effects and therapeutic applications. Many of these traditional remedies have been validated by modern chemistry. Ephedra for respiratory conditions contains ephedrine, a proven bronchodilator. Artemisia annua for fever contains artemisinin, now a frontline anti-malarial drug that earned its discoverer a Nobel Prize. Chinese medicine preserved knowledge of treatments that modern medicine would later rediscover and explain through different theoretical frameworks. But the most revolutionary transformation in ancient medicine happened in Greece, starting around 400 BCE with a physician named Hippocrates. What made Hippocrates different wasn't better surgical techniques or more effective remedies. What made him revolutionary was his epistemology, his theory of knowledge and how to acquire it. Hippocrates looked at disease and said something radical. This isn't divine punishment, and it's not caused by demons or evil spirits. Disease has natural causes, and we can understand those causes through observation and reason. This might seem obvious now, but in the ancient world it was genuinely shocking. Most cultures attributed disease to supernatural forces, angry gods, curses, spiritual contamination, demonic possession. Treatment involved appeasing the gods, casting out demons, performing purification rituals. Hippocrates rejected all of this. He insisted that diseases arose from natural imbalances in the body's four humours, blood, phlegm, yellow bile and black bile, and could be treated through natural means: diet, rest, herbal remedies, sometimes surgery. His humoral theory was wrong, obviously. We don't have four humours, and balancing them doesn't cure disease. But Hippocrates established something far more important than any specific theory: the principle that medicine should be based on observation, reason, and natural explanation, rather than superstition and prayer. He taught physicians to observe patients carefully, document symptoms precisely, track disease progression, and learn from both successes and failures. Most importantly, Hippocrates established medical ethics, the famous Hippocratic Oath, probably not written by Hippocrates himself but emerging from his school, committed physicians to benefiting patients, avoiding harm, maintaining confidentiality, and refusing to abuse their position. First, do no harm became medicine's fundamental principle. This created medicine as a profession, not just a technical skill, but a moral calling requiring practitioners to subordinate their own interest to patient welfare. Greek medicine spread throughout the Mediterranean as Alexander the Great's conquest created a unified cultural sphere. Medical knowledge from Egypt, Mesopotamia, Persia, and India flowed into Greek learning centres. The Great Library of Alexandria in Egypt became the world's first medical research institution, where physicians could study texts from across the known world, compare different approaches, and develop new theories. Then came the Romans, who weren't particularly interested in medical theory, but were brilliant at practical implementation. Roman civilization made one of history's most important contributions to human health: public health infrastructure. They built aqueducts to supply cities with clean water. They constructed elaborate sewage systems to remove waste. They established public baths where citizens could maintain hygiene. They created the first building codes requiring proper ventilation and sanitation. These measures probably saved more lives than any individual medical treatment of the ancient world. Clean water and effective sanitation prevent cholera, typhoid, dysentery, and countless other diseases. Roman engineering did more for public health than all the physicians of antiquity combined. They also developed military medicine, creating the first field hospitals where wounded soldiers could receive systematic care. Each Roman legion had medical personnel, equipped with surgical instruments, trained in wound treatment, organised to provide care efficiently during campaigns. This saved countless lives and ensured Roman military dominance for centuries. But the most influential figure in ancient medicine emerged in the late Roman period: Galen of Pergamon, practicing around 150 CE. Galen was extraordinarily skilled. He served as physician to gladiators, where he treated traumatic injuries and learned anatomy from the wounds he observed. He conducted animal dissections, describing muscles, bones, organs, and blood vessels in unprecedented detail. He performed public demonstrations of surgical procedures, proving his anatomical knowledge and skill. Most importantly, Galen wrote extensively, producing hundreds of texts that synthesized all previous medical knowledge while adding his own observations and theories. His works became the foundation of medical education for the next 1,400 years. Every medieval physician learned anatomy from Galen, therapy from Galen, theory from Galen. Here's the problem: Galen was wrong about a lot of things. He never dissected human bodies, only animals, so his anatomical descriptions contain significant errors. He believed blood was continuously produced by the liver and consumed by the tissues, not circulated in a closed loop by the heart. He thought the brain secreted mucus that drained out the nose. He attributed too much importance to the humoral theory, which, while useful as a framework, didn't actually explain disease mechanisms. But Galen's authority became so overwhelming that questioning his conclusions seemed almost heretical. His texts were preserved, translated and studied for over a millennium, becoming medical dogma rather than starting points for investigation. Medieval and Renaissance physicians would struggle to reconcile Galen's errors with their own observations, often assuming they must be misunderstanding rather than that Galen might be mistaken. This intellectual rigidity would hold medicine back for centuries, and then came disaster. In 48 BCE, during Julius Caesar's civil war, fire damaged the Library of Alexandria. Subsequent attacks and neglect over the following centuries destroyed most of what remained. By 400 CE, the greatest collection of ancient knowledge ever assembled was largely gone. We don't know exactly what was lost. That's the cruel irony. The texts that survived are those that happened to be copied and preserved elsewhere. But ancient sources reference thousands of medical works that have vanished completely. How much did we lose? What surgical techniques, pharmacological knowledge, or theoretical insights went up in smoke? We'll never know. But we do know that ancient physicians accomplished remarkable things. They performed successful surgeries, developed effective remedies, created ethical frameworks that still guide medicine today. Then much of that knowledge was lost, scattered, or distorted, and humanity would spend the next 1,000 years slowly, painfully, rediscovering what the ancient world had already learned. The age of classical medicine was ending. The structures that had supported learning and innovation were collapsing, and medicine was about to enter its strangest, most contradictory period. An age when the Islamic world preserved and advanced ancient knowledge, while Europe forgot almost everything its ancestors had known. Here's what nobody tells you about the Middle Ages. While Europe was bleeding patients to balance their humours and attributing disease to evil spirits, physicians in Baghdad were performing cataract surgeries, distinguishing between different infectious diseases and building hospitals with separate wards for different conditions. The medieval period wasn't one story. It was two completely different medical realities happening simultaneously on the same planet, and understanding why reveals something profound about how knowledge survives, dies, and gets reborn. Let's start with what was happening in Europe after Rome fell. Picture this. It's 500 CE, and the Western Roman Empire has just collapsed. All those medical schools, libraries, and hospitals the Romans built, gone. The sophisticated water systems that kept cities clean, falling apart. The trade networks that moved medical knowledge and supplies across continents, severed. Within a generation, European medicine had regressed 1,000 years. Physicians who had been reading Galen and Hippocrates in the original Greek were now scratching out folk remedies on scraps of parchment. Cities that had public hospitals were now hoping the local monk knew something about herbs. The knowledge wasn't completely lost, but it was scattered, fragmented, locked away in monasteries where maybe 1 in 100 monks could actually read Latin, let alone understand complex medical texts. And into this vacuum came practices that would define European medicine for the next 1,000 years. Bloodletting became the go-to treatment for almost everything. Got a fever? Bloodletting. Broken leg? Bloodletting. Plague? Definitely bloodletting. The logic was based on humoral theory, this ancient idea that the body contained 4 fluids, blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, and that disease resulted from imbalances between them. Bloodletting was supposed to restore balance by removing excess blood. Did it work? No. Did it probably kill thousands of patients who would have survived otherwise? Absolutely. But it made theoretical sense within their understanding of physiology, and when you're desperate and don't have better options, theory becomes practice. Now here's where it gets weird. Because Europeans needed bloodletting, but physicians considered it beneath their dignity, the job fell to barbers. Yeah, the same people cutting your hair were also slicing open your veins. This wasn't as random as it sounds. Barbers already had sharp instruments, steady hands, and experience working on people's bodies. They became the surgeons of medieval Europe, handling everything from tooth extractions to amputations. That red and white striped barber pole you still see today? Those are the colours of blood and bandages. You're looking at a medieval surgical advertisement every time you walk past one. But while Europe was having barbers perform surgery, something completely different was happening in the Islamic world. Starting around 750 CE, a scientific revolution was unfolding across the Middle East, North Africa and Spain. We call it the Islamic Golden Age, and in terms of medical advancement, it was golden in ways Europe wouldn't match for another 700 years. The Abbasid Caliphate, centered in Baghdad, became the intellectual capital of the world. Scholars were translating every Greek and Roman medical text they could find. Not just translating, but annotating, correcting, and expanding on them. They built libraries that held hundreds of thousands of manuscripts. They established hospitals that made Roman medical facilities look primitive. And then came the physicians who would change everything. First, meet Abu Bakr al-Razi, known in the West as Razors. Born in 854 CE in Persia, this guy was a practicing physician, chemist, and philosopher who ran hospitals in both Ray and Baghdad. His greatest achievement? He was the first physician in history to clearly distinguish smallpox from measles. This might not sound revolutionary, but think about what it meant. Before al-Razi, these two devastating diseases were treated as one condition. Physicians didn't know which patients would develop pustules, which would develop rashes, which treatments worked for what. Al-Razi observed hundreds of cases, documented their different symptoms, tracked their different progressions, and wrote a detailed clinical description that physicians could use to diagnose and treat each disease appropriately. He wasn't guessing. He was doing systematic clinical observation, the foundation of modern medicine. But al-Razi was just warming up. He wrote over 200 books and treatises on everything from medical ethics to kidney stones to psychiatric therapy. He pioneered the use of animal gut for sutures. He developed mercury ointments for skin diseases. Most remarkably for his time, he insisted on treating poor patients with the same care as wealthy ones. His book, The Diseases of Children, was the first medical text to treat pediatrics as a separate specialty requiring different approaches than adult medicine. He was creating the framework for specialized medicine 1,000 years before Europe caught up. Then came Ibn Sina, known in the West as Avicenna. If al-Razi was revolutionary, Ibn Sina was transcendent. Born in 980 CE near Bukhara in present-day Uzbekistan, this man was a genius in the truest sense. By age 18, he had memorized the Quran and mastered mathematics, astronomy, and medicine. By 21, he was writing books that would dominate medical education for the next 600 years. His masterwork, The Canon of Medicine, was essentially a 5-volume medical encyclopedia that systematized all existing medical knowledge, Greek, Roman, Persian, Indian, and added his own extensive observations and theories. The canon was extraordinary. It described the contagious nature of infectious diseases, suggesting they spread through tiny organisms in water and air. This was germ theory, 800 years before Pasteur and Koch. It explained how to conduct systematic drug trials, testing medications on animals before humans, varying doses to find optimal treatments, observing side effects carefully. It described meningitis, distinguished it from other diseases affecting the brain. It provided detailed anatomical descriptions based on dissection when European physicians were still forbidden from touching corpses. The canon became the standard medical textbook in both the Islamic world and later in Europe, used in medical schools well into the 1600s. When European medicine finally started advancing again during the Renaissance, they did it by reading translations of Ibn Sina. Islamic hospitals during this period were unlike anything in Europe. The Adudi Hospital in Baghdad had 24 physicians on staff, specialised wards for different diseases, a pharmacy, a library, and lecture halls for teaching. The Al-Mansuri Hospital in Cairo had separate wards for men and women, inpatient and outpatient facilities, gardens for medicinal plants, and running water in every room. They didn't charge patients. Treatment was free, funded by wealthy endowments and government support. The idea was that healthcare was a religious and civic duty, not a commercial transaction. Meanwhile, back in Europe, medicine was slowly crawling forward, but in strange and limited ways. The main centres of medical knowledge were monasteries. Monks and nuns became the healers of medieval Europe, not because they were trained physicians, but because they were literate and had access to the few medical texts that had survived Rome's collapse. They cultivated herb gardens with dozens of medicinal plants, sage for inflammation, feverfew for headaches, St. John's wort for wounds. They established infirmaries, the predecessors of hospitals, where sick travellers and local villagers could receive basic care. They copied medical manuscripts by hand, preserving fragments of ancient knowledge that would otherwise have been lost. But monastic medicine had severe limitations. Monks couldn't perform surgery. They couldn't study anatomy through dissection. Church doctrine emphasized spiritual healing over physical intervention. Disease was often viewed as divine punishment or demonic possession, requiring prayer and penance rather than medicine. The most advanced medical care many Europeans received was herbal tea and prayer. Then in 1347 everything changed. Ships arrived in Sicily carrying rats. The rats carried fleas. The fleas carried Yersinia pestis, the bacterium that causes bubonic plague. Within 5 years, the Black Death had killed between 75 and 200 million people, roughly a third of Europe's population. Entire villages disappeared. Cities lost half their inhabitants. The social order collapsed, and paradoxically, this catastrophe advanced medical understanding more than the previous 500 years combined. Because when a third of the population dies, and nothing you try makes any difference, traditional medical authority breaks down. Bloodletting doesn't work. Prayer doesn't work. Fleeing doesn't work. Physicians were dying at the same rates as everyone else, proving they didn't understand disease any better than peasants. This crisis forced European medicine to start asking harder questions. Physicians began systematic observation of plague symptoms. They documented how it spread, noting it seemed to pass from person to person through close contact. They tried quarantine measures, isolating sick individuals and establishing the first systematic public health policies. These measures didn't stop the plague. Bacteria was still centuries from discovery, but they represented a shift toward empirical thinking. Observation over theory, results over tradition. The plague also created opportunities. With so many physicians dead, there was suddenly space for new practitioners. Surgeons, who had been considered mere craftsmen, gained status and legitimacy. Universities that had previously only taught theory began accepting the need for practical anatomical training. The religious prohibitions against dissection started weakening, because understanding the body became an urgent necessity, not an academic luxury. And medieval surgery was more sophisticated than most people realize. Surgeons were performing cataract couching, pushing the clouded lens aside to restore vision. They were conducting caesarean sections to save mothers or babies during obstructed births. They were repairing hernias, removing bladder stones, and setting complex fractures. A 13th century surgical text by Henri de Mondeville describes procedures that wouldn't seem out of place in an 18th century hospital. The gap wasn't in surgical skill, but in understanding infection and antisepsis. Medieval surgeons could successfully operate, but their patients often died of sepsis days later, because nobody understood sterile technique. Women played crucial but complicated roles in medieval medicine. As midwives, they managed most childbirth, drawing on knowledge passed down through generations. As herbalists and healers, they treated local communities, especially the poor who couldn't afford university-trained physicians. Some women even practiced surgery. Historical records mention female surgeons in Italy and France, though they were rare exceptions. But as medicine became more formalized and professionalized during the late medieval period, women were increasingly excluded. Universities didn't admit them. Guilds wouldn't license them. And as their informal authority was challenged, many female healers faced accusations of witchcraft. The witch trials that began in the late medieval period and exploded during the early modern era targeted women healers disproportionately. If you were a woman with medical knowledge, especially knowledge of herbs that could cause abortions or relieve pain, you were suspect. If your treatments worked, you might be accused of using magic. If they failed, you might be blamed for deliberately harming patients. Tens of thousands of women were executed, and with them died generations of medical knowledge that had never been written down. Medieval mental health treatment was equally contradictory. Some Islamic physicians like Al-Razi advocated humane treatment, proper environments, and psychological therapy for mental illness. Some European monasteries provided compassionate care, believing mental affliction deserved the same kindness as physical disease. But many mentally ill people were imprisoned, chained, beaten, or killed, viewed as possessed by demons rather than suffering from disease. The gap between the best and worst treatment was vast, depending entirely on where you lived and who was caring for you. By 1450, as the medieval period ended, European medicine was finally beginning to catch up. The printing press was about to revolutionize knowledge distribution. Universities were expanding. Ancient texts, including Arabic translations of Greek works, were flooding back into Europe through Spain and Italy. The Renaissance was dawning, and with it would come an explosion of anatomical discovery and scientific methodology. But the medieval paradox had taught medicine something crucial. Knowledge is fragile. It can be lost, scattered, forgotten. The Islamic Golden Age preserved and advanced medicine while Europe regressed. Then Europe slowly rebuilt what it had lost, eventually surpassing its teachers. The lesson wasn't that one civilization was superior. The lesson was that medical progress requires institutional support, intellectual freedom, empirical observation, and the humility to learn from anyone who has knowledge worth sharing, regardless of their religion, nationality, or gender. The physicians who would create modern medicine in the coming centuries would need all these lessons, and they were about to get their chance. Picture this. It's 1543 in Padua, Italy. You're standing in a crowded anatomy theatre, packed shoulder to shoulder with hundreds of students, physicians, and curious citizens. Everyone's craning their necks to see the centre of the room, where a young Belgian anatomist named Andreas Vesalius is about to do something revolutionary. He's about to prove that everything medicine has believed for 1,400 years is wrong. Vesalius doesn't use an assistant to do the dirty work while he lectures from a high chair like traditional professors. No, he rolls up his sleeves and cuts into the cadaver himself, dissecting with precision, pointing out structures, inviting students to come closer to see with their own eyes. And what they see changes everything. The human jawbone isn't in two pieces like Galen claimed. It's one continuous bone. The liver doesn't have 5 lobes. The sternum isn't made of 7 segments. The blood vessels don't originate in the liver. Structure after structure, Vesalius is systematically demolishing the anatomical authority that has dominated medicine since the Roman Empire. The crowd is stunned, some are thrilled, others are furious. Because Galen wasn't just any physician. He was the physician, the unquestioned authority whose texts had been copied, studied, and revered for 14 centuries. Questioning Galen was like questioning the Bible. It was heresy. It was dangerous. It was absolutely necessary. Vesalius published his findings that same year in a book called De Humani Corporis Fabrica, on the fabric of the human body. 7 volumes of meticulous anatomical illustrations showing the human body as it actually was, not as ancient authorities claimed it should be. The drawings were revolutionary, created in collaboration with artists from Titian's workshop. They showed muscles, bones, organs, and vessels with unprecedented accuracy. For the first time in history, physicians could study human anatomy without access to actual cadavers. But here's what made Vesalius's revolution possible. It wasn't just his skill as an anatomist or his courage in challenging authority. It was a machine, a relatively simple machine invented 70 years earlier by a German goldsmith named Johannes Gutenberg, the printing press. Before the printing press, medical knowledge spread through hand-copied manuscripts. Slow, expensive, prone to copying errors. A single medical text could take months to reproduce and might contain only what the copyist thought important. Controversial ideas could be suppressed simply by refusing to copy them. Innovation moved at the speed of monks with quill pens. The printing press changed everything. Vesalius's anatomy text was printed in hundreds of copies that spread across Europe within months. Other physicians could verify his observations, correct his errors, build on his discoveries. Within a generation, medical schools across Europe were incorporating his anatomical insights into their curricula. Knowledge was no longer locked away in monastery libraries or controlled by a small elite. It was becoming democratic, accessible, unstoppable. And the floodgates opened. Medical innovation began accelerating at a pace that would have been unimaginable just decades earlier. New books appeared challenging not just Galen's anatomy, but the entire framework of ancient medicine. Enter Paracelsus, a Swiss physician who made Vesalius look polite by comparison. In 1527, Paracelsus celebrated his appointment as city physician of Basel by publicly burning the works of Galen and Avicenna in front of his students. Not metaphorically, actually burning them. He declared that his shoe buckles knew more than those ancient authorities, that the beard on his chin was more learned than all the professors who blindly followed outdated dogma. Paracelsus was many things: arrogant, difficult, possibly alcoholic, definitely impossible to work with. He lasted less than a year in Basel before being essentially run out of town. But he was also brilliant, and his ideas would transform medicine in ways that are still relevant today. He rejected the ancient theory of the 4 humours entirely. Instead, he proposed that diseases were caused by external agents, specific things that entered the body and caused specific illnesses. This was radical. For thousands of years, medicine had viewed disease as an internal imbalance. Paracelsus was saying, no, diseases come from outside, they have specific causes. And if they have specific causes, they might have specific cures. This led him to pioneer chemical pharmacology. Instead of treating illnesses with plant remedies and attempts to balance humours, Paracelsus experimented with minerals, metals, and chemical compounds. He was the first physician to use chemicals like mercury, sulfur, iron, and copper sulfate as medicines. Some of his treatments were toxic, dangerous, occasionally fatal. But some worked, and his fundamental insight that diseases required specific chemical treatments would eventually lead to modern pharmacology. He also introduced the concept of dose making the poison. The same substance could cure or kill depending on the amount. This seems obvious now, but it was revolutionary at the time. It meant that even toxic substances could be medicines if used correctly. Every modern medication, every careful dosage calculation, every warning label about proper use traces back to Paracelsus's insight. But while European physicians were revolutionizing anatomy and chemistry, something else was happening that would have even more profound medical consequences. Europeans were sailing to the Americas, and they were bringing death with them. The Columbian Exchange, the massive transfer of plants, animals, people, and yes, diseases between the Old World and the New, created the greatest epidemiological catastrophe in human history. Within a century of Columbus's arrival, somewhere between 56 and 90% of the indigenous population of the Americas was dead. Not from conquest, not from warfare, but from diseases their immune systems had never encountered. Smallpox, measles, typhus, influenza, even chickenpox. Diseases that were merely unpleasant for Europeans who had evolved some resistance over millennia of exposure, were apocalyptic for indigenous Americans. Entire civilizations collapsed. Cities were abandoned. Agricultural systems failed. Knowledge accumulated over thousands of years vanished as elders died before they could pass it to the next generation. European physicians watched this catastrophe unfold and mostly shrugged. Many saw it as divine providence, God clearing the land for Christian settlement. Few attempted to understand why indigenous people were so susceptible, or what could be done to help them. The concept of population immunity, of diseases requiring previous exposure to build resistance, was still centuries away from being understood. But the exchange went both ways. Europeans brought diseases to the Americas, but they also brought back new ones. Syphilis, or at least a particularly virulent strain of it, appeared in Europe shortly after Columbus's return. Within 5 years, it had spread across the continent, causing devastating epidemics. The disease was unlike anything European physicians had seen: ulcerating lesions, bone deformations, neurological damage, and eventually death. Physicians tried everything: mercury treatments, which were almost as deadly as the disease; guaiac wood imported from the Caribbean, which did nothing; prayer, which was equally ineffective. The disease persisted, killing, maiming, and terrifying for centuries. It would take 400 years before anyone discovered its true cause or developed an effective treatment. The Americas also gave Europe new medicines. Cinchona bark from Peru, which contained quinine and could treat malaria. Tobacco, which Europeans initially adopted as a medicine before realizing it was addictive and harmful. Coca leaves, ipecac, and dozens of other plant remedies that indigenous healers had developed over millennia. But European physicians mostly ignored or dismissed indigenous medical knowledge. They were too convinced of their own superiority, too certain that Galenic medicine, despite its obvious failures, was more sophisticated than anything primitive peoples could have developed. This arrogance cost countless lives and delayed medical progress by centuries. Meanwhile, back in Europe, another revolution was brewing. An English physician named William Harvey was studying the heart, and he was about to overturn another 1,000-year-old assumption. Galen had taught that blood was continuously created in the liver, infused with natural spirit, pumped to the heart where it received vital spirit, and then consumed by the body's tissues. It was a one-way system, blood flowing out from the centre and being used up at the periphery. This meant the body had to constantly produce new blood, massive quantities of it, to replace what was consumed. Harvey looked at this theory and saw immediately it was impossible. The heart pumped too fast, moved too much blood. If Galen was right, the liver would have to produce hundreds of pounds of blood per hour. Where would all the raw materials come from? Where would all the consumed blood go? So Harvey did experiments. He tied off arteries and watched blood pool on the heart side. He tied off veins and watched blood pool on the extremity side. He calculated the volume of blood the heart pumped with each beat and multiplied it by the number of beats per hour. The math was clear. The body didn't create and consume blood. Blood circulated. It moved from the heart through arteries to the tissues, then returned through veins back to the heart to be pumped again. The same blood, going round and round, carrying nutrients and removing wastes. Harvey published his findings in 1628 in a book called De Motu Cordis, on the motion of the heart. It was meticulous, mathematical, supported by careful observations and experiments. It was also almost completely ignored. Why? Because Harvey couldn't explain the mechanism. He could prove blood circulated, but he couldn't see how it moved from arteries to veins. There had to be connections, tiny vessels too small to see. But without microscopes powerful enough to observe them, his theory seemed incomplete. Many physicians rejected it entirely. Some grudgingly accepted the observations but claimed they didn't really contradict Galen if you interpreted the ancient texts creatively enough. It would take decades before Harvey's circulation theory was fully accepted. But he had done something even more important than discovering how blood moves. He had demonstrated the power of the experimental method. Don't just read what ancient authorities claimed. Observe, measure, test. Let the evidence lead you to conclusions, even if they contradict everything you've been taught. This was the scientific method beginning to take root in medicine, and it would change everything. Within a few decades, other researchers were building on Harvey's approach. They were designing experiments, making careful observations, questioning assumptions, and they were building new instruments that would reveal entirely new worlds. In the 1670s, a Dutch draper named Antony van Leeuwenhoek started grinding lenses as a hobby. He got good at it. Very good. He created microscopes with magnifications exceeding 200x, far better than anything available at the time. And then he started looking at everything he could find. Water from a nearby lake, scrapings from his own teeth, blood, semen, pepper water. In sample after sample, he saw something that stunned him. Tiny creatures, smaller than anything visible to the naked eye, swimming, moving, living. He called them animalcules, little animals. We call them bacteria, protozoa, blood cells, sperm cells. Van Leeuwenhoek had discovered the microbial world, an entire realm of life that humans had never known existed. He wrote detailed letters to the Royal Society in London describing what he saw. Many scientists were skeptical. Invisible creatures. It sounded like fantasy. But those who could replicate his microscopes confirmed his observations. The invisible world was real. This should have revolutionized medicine immediately. After all, if tiny living creatures existed everywhere, might they cause disease? Might the plague, typhus, smallpox be caused by these animalcules entering the body? But that insight wouldn't come for another 2 centuries. The technology existed to see microorganisms, but the conceptual framework to understand their role in disease didn't. Physicians looked at van Leeuwenhoek's discoveries and mostly shrugged. Interesting curiosity, but what did it have to do with medicine? And so they went back to bleeding patients. Physicians in 1700 knew more about anatomy than any previous generation. They understood circulation. They had access to new chemical medicines. They could observe microscopic life. And yet they were still draining blood from sick people to balance non-existent humours, still prescribing toxic metals that did more harm than good, still killing patients with treatments that had no scientific basis. The problem was simple. Knowledge doesn't equal understanding. You can know anatomical facts without understanding physiology. You can observe microorganisms without comprehending their relationship to disease. You can develop scientific methods without applying them systematically to medical practice. The Renaissance had opened doors, revealed new worlds, shattered old certainties. But walking through those doors, making sense of those worlds, building new certainties, based on evidence rather than authority, that would take longer. Much longer. The tools were in place. The experimental method, anatomical knowledge, chemical medicine, microscopy, all the pieces needed for modern medicine to emerge. But they hadn't been assembled yet. That synthesis, that transformation of scattered insights into a coherent understanding of how the body worked and how disease could be treated, that was still waiting in the future. The Renaissance had been a revolution in knowledge, but the revolution in healing was still to come. Picture this. It's 1796, a quiet spring day in rural England. A doctor named Edward Jenner is doing something that would get him arrested today. He's taking pus from an infected milkmaid's hand and deliberately scratching it into the arm of an 8-year-old boy. The boy's name is James Phipps. He's the son of Jenner's gardener, and Jenner is about to perform one of the most dangerous experiments in medical history. The milkmaid, Sarah Nelmes, has cowpox, a relatively mild disease that dairy workers often caught from infected cattle. Her hand is covered in pustules, oozing and painful, but not life-threatening. Jenner has a theory. He's noticed that milkmaids rarely get smallpox, the disease that kills 400,000 Europeans every year, that leaves survivors blind and scarred, that causes mothers to wait weeks before naming their children because so many die in infancy. He thinks cowpox somehow protects against smallpox, so he takes material from Sarah's pustules and inoculates young James. Then he waits. Days pass. James develops a mild fever, a small sore at the inoculation site. Nothing serious. He recovers within a week, and then Jenner does something truly audacious. 6 weeks later, he deliberately exposes James to smallpox. He inoculates the boy with material from an active smallpox case. The kind of infection that kills 1 in 3 people who catch it. If Jenner is wrong, he's just murdered a child. If he's right, he's about to change human history forever. James doesn't get sick, not even mildly. The smallpox simply doesn't take. His immune system, primed by the cowpox exposure, recognizes and destroys the smallpox virus before it can establish infection. Jenner has just discovered vaccination, not just a treatment for one disease, but a fundamental principle of immunology that would eventually save more lives than any other medical intervention in human history. Within a few years, vaccination spreads across Europe. Within decades, it reaches every continent. Within 2 centuries, smallpox becomes the first and only human disease ever completely eradicated from Earth. The last natural case occurs in Somalia in 1977. A disease that had killed billions throughout human history simply gone. Jenner hadn't just treated a disease, he'd defeated it, permanently. But here's the dark irony. While Jenner was making this breakthrough in rural England, most European hospitals were death traps, literal killing grounds where more people died from coming to the hospital than from whatever brought them there in the first place. Walk into a typical 18th century hospital and the smell hits you first. Putrefaction, excrement, gangrene. Patients lie 6 to a bed, sometimes mixing surgical cases with fever patients, the dying with those who might recover. There are no hand-washing stations. Doctors move from autopsy to surgery without cleaning their instruments or their hands. They wear the same blood-crusted coats day after day, treating the stains as badges of experience. The more encrusted with blood and pus, the more successful the surgeon, and people die. Not occasionally, not rarely, but systematically. In some hospitals, 25 to 40% of surgical patients die, not from their injuries or diseases, but from what doctors call hospital fever. Massive infections that sweep through wards, killing dozens at a time. Women who come to hospitals to give birth fare even worse. In some urban maternity wards, 1 in 4 mothers dies of childbed fever. They arrive healthy, deliver successfully, and then within days develop raging fevers and die in agony. The doctors have no idea what's killing them. Some think it's miasma, bad air. Others blame the patients themselves, their moral character or constitution. Nobody suspects that the doctors are the problem, that their unwashed hands moving from patient to patient, from autopsy room to delivery ward, are carrying death with them. But some things are improving, slowly, quietly, often by accident. Take obstetric forceps. 2 brothers, Peter and Paul Chamberlain, invent them around 1600, but here's where it gets dark. They don't share the invention, they keep it secret. For over a century, the Chamberlain family makes a fortune by being mysteriously successful at difficult births. When they're called to a delivery, they make everyone leave the room. They have the mother blindfolded. They bring in a massive decorated chest, making a show of its weight and importance. Then, in private, they use the forceps to save lives that would otherwise be lost, and they tell no one. Think about that. They have a tool that could save thousands of lives and they keep it secret for profit. It's not until 1733 that the design finally becomes public. Within decades, maternal mortality starts dropping. Not dramatically, not everywhere, but enough that more mothers survive childbirth, more families stay intact. It's a genuine advance, but one that was delayed by greed for over 100 years. Meanwhile, medicine is professionalizing, but not in ways that are entirely good. Medical schools are expanding. Licensing requirements are being established. Doctors are forming professional associations to regulate practice and maintain standards. Sounds positive, right? Except they're also using these new powers to eliminate competition. Folk healers, mostly women, who have been caring for their communities for generations, suddenly find themselves prosecuted for practicing without licenses. Midwives are pushed aside by male obstetricians despite often having better outcomes. Traditional herbal remedies are dismissed as superstition even when they work. The professionalization of medicine isn't just about raising standards. It's about controlling who gets to heal, who gets to profit, and whose knowledge counts as legitimate. And that opens the door for something strange. As orthodox medicine becomes more rigid and controlled, alternative systems explode in popularity. Franz Mesmer develops animal magnetism, claiming he can cure diseases through manipulating invisible magnetic fluids in the body. He treats patients in darkened rooms, waving magnetized iron rods while dramatic music plays. It's complete nonsense, but it works, at least sometimes, because Mesmer has accidentally discovered the placebo effect and the power of suggestion. Then comes Samuel Hahnemann with homeopathy. His theory is that substances that cause symptoms in healthy people can cure those same symptoms in sick people, if diluted to astronomical degrees. He's talking about dilutions so extreme that not a single molecule of the original substance remains. Just water, treated as if it remembers what was once dissolved in it. By any rational standard, it shouldn't work, and controlled studies consistently show it doesn't work better than placebo. But in the early 1800s, when orthodox medicine's main treatments are bloodletting, purging, and mercury poisoning, homeopathy's gentle approach of doing essentially nothing actually produces better outcomes. Patients recover because homeopathy doesn't actively harm them, unlike conventional treatments. The Age of Enlightenment is producing enlightenment and nonsense in equal measure. But something genuinely revolutionary is also happening quietly in the asylums. For centuries, the mentally ill have been treated worse than animals. Chained to walls, kept in cages, beaten when they act out. Most people believe mental illness is demon possession or moral failing. Asylums are more like prisons than hospitals. Then, in 1793, Philippe Pinel walks into the Bicêtre Hospital in Paris during the chaos of the French Revolution. He's just been appointed physician to the insane, and he does something unprecedented. He unchains the patients. His colleagues think he's insane himself. These are dangerous madmen, they warn. They'll kill you. They'll escape and terrorize the city. Pinel does it anyway. He removes the chains, improves the living conditions, starts treating patients with kindness and respect. And something remarkable happens. The patients calm down, many improve, some recover enough to leave the asylum. Pinel hasn't discovered the cure for mental illness, but he's discovered something almost as important. That the mentally ill are still human beings, that their conditions can be influenced by environment and treatment, that cruelty makes everything worse. He calls his approach moral treatment. The idea spreads. Asylums across Europe and America begin adopting more humane practices. It won't last. By the late 1800s, asylums will again become warehouses for the unwanted. But for a few decades, there's genuine progress in recognizing the humanity of those with mental illness. And that's creating something else. A slowly dawning awareness that maybe, just maybe, disease isn't entirely about individual patients. Maybe it's also about populations, environments, and conditions that affect entire communities. The public health movement is beginning, driven not by doctors but by social reformers who notice patterns. Cholera outbreaks cluster around certain water sources. Typhus thrives in overcrowded slums. Children in wealthy neighborhoods survive diseases that kill children in poor neighborhoods. These observations lead to sanitation reforms. Cities start building proper sewers. Water supplies are separated from waste disposal. Streets are paved and cleaned regularly, and death rates drop dramatically. In some cities, mortality falls by 30 to 40% within a few decades, not because medicine gets better, but because living conditions improve. The greatest medical advance of the era might not be a drug or procedure, but plumbing. Vaccination campaigns are starting too. Governments begin mandating smallpox vaccination for children. It's controversial. People protest, claiming it violates their freedom, that it's dangerous, that it goes against God's will. Sound familiar? But the campaigns work. Smallpox deaths plummet wherever vaccination is widely adopted. For the first time in human history, governments are taking systematic action to prevent disease in entire populations, not just treating the sick, but stopping people from getting sick in the first place. Then, toward the end of this period, comes perhaps the most dramatic breakthrough of all. Surgery, for thousands of years, has been a nightmare. Imagine you need your leg amputated. You're strapped to a table. 4 strong men hold you down. The surgeon works as fast as possible, sawing through bone and flesh while you scream. The best surgeons can amputate a leg in under 3 minutes, because patients often die from the shock and pain if it takes longer. Most patients choose to die rather than undergo surgery. Then, in the 1840s, everything changes. October 16th, 1846. Massachusetts General Hospital. A dentist named William Morton demonstrates the use of ether as an anesthetic. The patient, a young man named Gilbert Abbott, needs a tumour removed from his neck. Morton administers the ether. Abbott falls unconscious. The surgeon, John Collins Warren, makes his incision. Abbott doesn't move, doesn't scream. Warren removes the tumour. The operation takes 25 minutes, far longer than would have been possible with a conscious patient. Abbott wakes up afterward, groggy but alive, with no memory of pain. Warren turns to the stunned audience of medical students and doctors and says 5 words that will echo through history. "Gentlemen, this is no humbug." Within months, ether is being used in hospitals across America and Europe. Within a year, chloroform is introduced as an alternative, faster acting and more pleasant smelling, though more dangerous. Surgery is transformed overnight. Operations that were impossible because they took too long can now be attempted. Patients who would have chosen death over the agony of conscious surgery now have hope. Surgeons can work carefully, precisely, without patients thrashing in agony. But here's the problem. Anesthesia solves the pain, but not the infection. Surgeons can now take their time, perform more complex operations, go deeper into the body. And more patients die. Because longer operations mean more exposure to contamination. Because surgeons still don't wash their hands or sterilize their instruments. Because nobody yet understands what causes surgical infections. The discovery that will solve that problem is still a few years away, but the stage is set. By 1850, medicine has vaccination, anesthesia, the beginnings of public health, and a growing institutional infrastructure. What it doesn't have is a unifying theory of disease causation. Doctors still think infections arise spontaneously from bad air or imbalanced humours. They don't understand why some treatments work and others fail. They can't see the microscopic enemies that cause most human disease. But that's about to change. In laboratories across Europe, scientists are beginning to peer into a hidden world. A world of tiny living things that swarm everywhere, invisible to the naked eye. A world where humanity's real enemies have been hiding all along. The germ theory revolution is coming, and it will change everything. Picture this. Vienna, 1847. The world's most advanced maternity hospital, where the best doctors in Europe deliver babies using the latest techniques. But women are dying. Not occasionally, not from rare complications. They're dying in droves at rates that would make a medieval plague look merciful. In one ward, nearly 1 in 3 mothers who come in to give birth never leave alive. They develop fevers within days of delivery. Their abdomens swell. They scream in agony as infection ravages their bodies. Then they die, leaving orphaned newborns and devastated families. The doctors call it childbed fever, puerperal sepsis, and they have absolutely no idea what causes it. But here's where it gets truly bizarre. The hospital has 2 maternity wards. In the first ward, where medical students and doctors deliver babies, the death rate is catastrophic. 10%, sometimes 15%, sometimes higher. In the second ward, where midwives handle deliveries, the death rate is around 2%. Same hospital, same year, same city, wildly different outcomes. Women literally beg not to be assigned to the doctor's ward. Some choose to give birth on the street, rather, than face what they call the doctor's death. Enter Ignaz Semmelweis, a Hungarian physician who notices something everyone else has overlooked. The medical students in the first ward spend their mornings in the autopsy room, dissecting corpses of women who died from childbed fever. Then they walk directly to the delivery ward and examine pregnant women, without washing their hands, without changing clothes, with particles of decayed tissue still under their fingernails. The midwives in the second ward, they never go near the autopsy room. Semmelweis makes a connection that seems obvious now but was revolutionary then. What if the doctors are carrying something from the dead bodies to the living mothers? What if death itself is somehow transferable, invisible particles of mortality passing from corpse to patient through the doctor's contaminated hands? He proposes something radical. What if everyone washed their hands with chlorinated lime solution before examining patients? His colleagues think he's insane. The idea that educated gentlemen physicians could be causing disease was insulting, ridiculous. Doctors were healers, not killers. Their social status, their years of education, their refined manner, these things meant they couldn't possibly be vectors of death. But Semmelweis implements his hand-washing protocol anyway, and the death rate in the first ward plummets from 15% to less than 2% in a single month. Hundreds of women who would have died continue living. It's one of the most dramatic medical interventions in history. You'd think this would make Semmelweis a hero. You'd be wrong. His colleagues are outraged. The implication that they've been killing patients through their own carelessness is too much to bear. They mock him, ostracize him, eventually drive him out of Vienna entirely. Semmelweis becomes increasingly bitter and erratic. He writes open letters to prominent physicians calling them murderers. He's not wrong, but he's not winning allies either. In 1865, at age 47, he's committed to an insane asylum. 2 weeks later, he's dead, possibly beaten by guards, his hands ironically infected with the same kind of sepsis he'd spent his career fighting. The medical establishment barely notices his passing. But something was happening that would vindicate Semmelweis posthumously. While he was fighting and failing to convince doctors to wash their hands, other scientists were discovering what he had suspected all along. That disease was caused by living organisms too small to see, that these organisms could be transmitted from person to person, that the invisible world was teeming with killers. Louis Pasteur wasn't a physician. He was a chemist investigating why wine sometimes went bad. But his experiments with fermentation led him to a radical conclusion. Microorganisms were everywhere, floating in the air, living on surfaces, and they could cause profound changes in organic matter. Food spoilage, fermentation, and, possibly, disease. Through brilliant experiments with swan-necked flasks, Pasteur proved that microorganisms didn't spontaneously generate from nothing. They came from other microorganisms. Life only came from life. This demolished the theory of spontaneous generation that had dominated scientific thinking for 2,000 years. Meanwhile, in Germany, Robert Koch was taking this further. He was isolating specific bacteria and proving they cause specific diseases. He developed techniques for growing pure cultures of microorganisms, staining them so they could be seen under microscopes, photographing them as evidence. In 1876, he proved that anthrax was caused by a specific bacterium. In 1882, he identified the tuberculosis bacterium, the biggest killer of the 19th century. In 1883, he found the cholera bacterium in contaminated water in Egypt. Koch developed postulates, rules, for proving a specific microorganism caused a specific disease. Isolate it from sick individuals, grow it in pure culture, introduce it to a healthy organism and reproduce the disease. Isolate it again from the newly infected organism. It sounds simple now. It was revolutionary then. Together, Pasteur and Koch established germ theory. Disease wasn't caused by bad air, moral failing, or imbalanced humours. It was caused by specific, identifiable microorganisms that could be studied, tracked, and potentially controlled. This transformed medicine from an art based on tradition and guesswork into a science based on observation and evidence. For the first time in 300,000 years of human history, doctors actually understood what they were fighting. But understanding germs and stopping them were different challenges. Enter Joseph Lister, a British surgeon who read Pasteur's work and had a revelation. If microorganisms caused fermentation and food spoilage, maybe they caused the horrific infections that killed half of all surgery patients. The gangrene, the pus, the fever, maybe these weren't inevitable consequences of cutting into human bodies. Maybe they were preventable infections. In 1865, the same year Semmelweis died in an asylum, Lister began spraying surgical wounds with carbolic acid to kill microorganisms. The results were astonishing. Survival rates for amputations improved from 50% to 85% almost immediately. Lister developed increasingly sophisticated antiseptic techniques, sterilizing instruments, cleaning surgical sites, creating barriers between the open wound and the contaminated air. Mortality rates continued to plummet. Surgery went from a desperate last resort where death was expected to a routine medical procedure where survival was normal. Think about what this meant. For all of human history, surgery had been a horror show. Screaming patients held down by strong men while surgeons worked as fast as possible to minimize trauma and blood loss. No anesthesia until the 1840s, no understanding of infection. Success meant surviving the procedure, and the inevitable fever that followed. Now, suddenly, surgery was becoming safe. Doctors could take their time, work carefully, attempt complex procedures that would have been death sentences a generation earlier. The human body, previously a fortress that could barely be breached without killing the patient, was becoming accessible to medical intervention. Then in 1895, something happened that sounds like science fiction. Wilhelm Röntgen, a German physicist, was experimenting with cathode rays in his laboratory. He noticed something strange. A fluorescent screen across the room was glowing, even though it wasn't in the direct path of the rays. He put various objects between the cathode ray tube and the screen: wood, metal, paper. Some blocked the mysterious rays, others didn't. Then he put his hand in front of the screen and saw something no human had ever seen before. The bones of his own living hand visible through his flesh like a ghostly skeleton. He had discovered X-rays. Within weeks, Röntgen's discovery spread around the world. Within months, doctors were using X-rays to locate bullets in wounded soldiers, diagnose broken bones, identify foreign objects in patients. For the first time in history, physicians could see inside living bodies without cutting them open. The implications were staggering. A technology discovered by accident in a physics laboratory immediately revolutionized medical diagnosis. The invisible world was becoming visible, and not just at the microscopic level, but inside living, breathing human beings. But seeing disease and understanding it didn't automatically mean curing it. That required a different kind of revolution. In 1909, Paul Ehrlich, a German physician and chemist, announced he'd found something he called a magic bullet, a chemical compound that could kill disease-causing microorganisms inside the human body without killing the patient. His compound, salvicin, was the 606th chemical he'd tested against syphilis. The first 605 had failed, but 606 worked. Not perfectly, not without side effects, but it worked. For the first time, doctors had a chemical weapon they could use against infectious disease. Ehrlich called it chemotherapy. The idea was revolutionary. Instead of just supporting the body while it fought infection, or cutting out diseased tissue, doctors could now introduce chemicals that would seek out and destroy pathogens. The magic bullet wasn't so magic. Salvarsan was toxic and difficult to administer, but it proved the concept was possible. Disease could be fought with chemistry, not just surgery and prayer. The magic bullet that would change everything came from an unlikely place. A messy laboratory in London, 1928. Alexander Fleming, a Scottish bacteriologist with a reputation for cluttered workspaces, returned from vacation to find his bacterial cultures contaminated with mould. Most scientists would have thrown them out and started over. Fleming noticed something odd. Around the mould, the bacteria were dead. The mould was killing them. He identified the mould as Penicillium notatum and isolated the compound it produced, penicillin. Then, like Semmelweis before him, he struggled to get anyone to care. Penicillin was difficult to produce, unstable, and Fleming couldn't figure out how to purify it for medical use. For over a decade, his discovery gathered dust in medical journals, while people continued dying from bacterial infections that penicillin could have cured. Then World War II started, and suddenly infected wounds were killing as many soldiers as bullets. A team at Oxford, led by Howard Florey and Ernst Boris Chain, figured out how to mass-produce penicillin. By 1944, there was enough to treat every Allied soldier who needed it. Infections that would have been death sentences became treatable with a simple injection. Pneumonia, scarlet fever, gangrene, syphilis, all suddenly manageable. Penicillin saved more lives during World War II than any weapon destroyed. The antibiotic era had begun. Within years, researchers discovered streptomycin, effective against tuberculosis, then tetracycline, effective against a broad spectrum of bacteria, then dozens more. Infectious diseases that had killed millions, that had shaped human history, that had culled populations since the dawn of time, were becoming treatable. Child mortality plummeted. Life expectancy soared. The ancient killers, plague, cholera, typhus, were retreating before an arsenal of chemical weapons they had no defense against. But other medical breakthroughs were happening simultaneously. In 1901, Karl Landsteiner discovered blood types, explaining why some blood transfusions saved lives while others killed patients. Blood wasn't just blood. There were different types, A, B, AB, O, and mixing incompatible types caused catastrophic reactions. Understanding this made transfusions safe and routine. By World War I, doctors were performing battlefield transfusions, replacing blood lost to trauma. By the 1930s, hospitals were establishing blood banks, storing donated blood for emergencies. The ability to replace lost blood transformed trauma care, making survival possible for injuries that would have been invariably fatal just decades earlier. These weren't just incremental improvements. This was a complete transformation of human medicine. In 1850, doctors were still using leeches and believing in miasma. By 1945, they had antibiotics, X-rays, safe surgery, blood transfusions, and a scientific understanding of disease. The change was so rapid, so complete, that a physician from 1850 would barely recognize the medicine of 1945 as the same profession. But there was a dark side, a shadow, growing alongside all this miraculous progress. The same scientific rigor that was saving lives was being twisted to justify atrocities. Eugenics, the idea that human populations could be improved through selective breeding, gained scientific respectability. In the United States, over 60,000 people were forcibly sterilized. In Nazi Germany, eugenics provided pseudo-scientific justification for genocide. Medical doctors, trained to heal, designed the gas chambers, selected victims, conducted grotesque experiments on concentration camp prisoners, all in the name of scientific progress and racial purity. The Tuskegee syphilis study, beginning in 1932, left hundreds of black men untreated for syphilis, even after penicillin was proven effective, just to study the disease's natural progression. Japanese Unit 731 conducted biological warfare experiments on Chinese prisoners, vivisection without anesthesia, deliberate infection with plague and cholera, frostbite experiments. These weren't rogue actors. These were trained physicians, products of the same scientific revolution that was saving millions of lives. Medicine had become powerful, more powerful than ever before in human history. And like all power, it could be used to heal or to harm, to save or to destroy. The germ theory revolution had given humanity the tools to fight disease on a scale previously unimaginable. But it had also revealed something troubling. That scientific knowledge without ethical restraint was dangerous. That medicine needed more than just technical skill. It needed moral boundaries, patient rights, oversight, and accountability. By 1945, as World War II ended and the extent of medical atrocities became public, the medical community faced a reckoning. The Nuremberg trials would establish principles for ethical human experimentation. The World Medical Association would create the Declaration of Geneva, a modern version of the Hippocratic Oath, emphasizing patient welfare and medical ethics. Medicine would have to be more than just effective. It would have to be ethical. But even as doctors grappled with these dark revelations, the pace of medical innovation was accelerating. The war had proven what was possible when resources and urgency aligned. Penicillin mass production, battlefield surgery techniques, trauma care systems, these innovations had saved countless lives, and they were just the beginning. The post-war world would see medical breakthroughs that would have seemed like magic, even to the physicians of 1945. The revolution that began with Semmelweis's hand-washing and Pasteur's microscope was about to explode into something unprecedented. Medicine was entering its golden age. Picture this. It's 1952, and a 6-year-old girl named Karen is lying in a hospital bed, unable to move. 3 days ago, she was playing in her backyard. Now she can barely breathe. The doctors have a name for what's killing her. Poliomyelitis, infantile paralysis, the disease that was terrorizing parents across America and Europe, striking seemingly at random, turning healthy children into paralyzed victims overnight. Karen's parents can only watch as nurses place their daughter inside an iron lung, a massive metal cylinder that will breathe for her because her own muscles can no longer do the job. The machine hisses and clicks, forcing air in and out of her paralyzed chest. She might survive, she might not, and even if she does, she'll probably never walk again. In the hallway, other iron lungs line the walls like steel coffins, rows of children's heads sticking out of metal tubes, their bodies trapped inside mechanical breathers. Some have been there for weeks, others for months. A few will never leave. This was the reality of medicine in the immediate post-war years. We had just defeated fascism, split the atom, and begun planning humanity's expansion into space. But we couldn't stop a virus from crippling thousands of children every summer. Parents lived in terror of polio season. Public swimming pools closed. Children were kept indoors. Nobody knew how it spread or why some children got severely ill, while others barely showed symptoms. Then, everything changed. On April 12, 1955, the announcement came. Jonas Salk's vaccine worked. Years of careful testing involving over 1 million schoolchildren, the largest medical trial in history, had proven that you could prevent polio with a simple injection. Not treat it after infection. Prevent it entirely. The news hit like a thunderbolt. Church bells rang across America. People poured into the streets celebrating. Parents wept with relief. Jonas Salk became an instant national hero. When asked who owned the patent to the vaccine, he famously replied, Well, the people, I would say. There is no patent. Could you patent the sun? Within a decade, polio cases in the United States dropped by 99%. The rows of iron lungs began to empty. Children who would have been paralyzed grew up healthy and strong, and this was just the beginning. The polio vaccine proved something revolutionary. You could take the most feared diseases in history and simply eliminate them, not manage them, not reduce their severity, actually eradicate them from human populations. The floodgates opened. Within 20 years, vaccines had been developed for measles, mumps, rubella, chickenpox. Diseases that had killed millions of children throughout history were becoming medical footnotes. Parents no longer had to wonder which of their children would survive to adulthood. For the first time in 300,000 years of human history, childhood mortality began a steep, sustained decline that continues to this day. But something even more radical was happening in operating rooms. December 23, 1954. Boston. A surgical team led by Joseph Murray is attempting something that most doctors considered impossible, maybe even blasphemous. They're going to take a healthy kidney from one human being and put it inside another. Not just any two humans, identical twins. Richard Herrick is dying of kidney failure. His twin brother Ronald has agreed to donate one of his kidneys. The surgery is technically straightforward. You disconnect the failing organ, connect the new one, and make sure the blood vessels and ureter are properly attached. The real problem is rejection. Every previous attempt at organ transplantation had failed because the recipient's immune system recognized the foreign organ as an invader and destroyed it. But identical twins have identical immune systems. In theory, Richard's body shouldn't recognize Ronald's kidney as foreign. In theory. The surgery takes 5.5 hours. When they restore blood flow to the transplanted kidney, everyone in the operating room holds their breath. Then it starts working. Clear yellow urine begins flowing from the transplanted organ. Richard Herrick's body is accepting his brother's kidney. He would live another 8 years. Not a long life by modern standards, but 8 years he wouldn't have had without that transplanted organ. The era of transplant surgery had begun, but the twin transplant was just a proof of concept. The real challenge was figuring out how to transplant organs between non-identical people. How do you stop the immune system from rejecting foreign tissue without completely destroying the body's ability to fight infections? The answer came in stages. First, doctors discovered drugs that could suppress the immune system, chemicals that would turn down the body's defenses just enough to prevent rejection without leaving patients completely vulnerable to every passing infection. It was like trying to partially turn off a security system while your house was in a dangerous neighborhood. Too much suppression and infections would kill you. Too little and rejection would destroy the transplanted organ. But by the early 1960s, doctors were successfully transplanting kidneys between unrelated donors and recipients. Then came livers in 1967, then hearts. Christian Barnard performed the first human heart transplant in Cape Town, South Africa, on December 3, 1967. The patient, Louis Washkansky, survived 18 days before dying of pneumonia, his immune system weakened by the drugs keeping his body from rejecting Denise Darville's heart. But 18 days proved it could be done. Within a year, hundreds of heart transplants were being attempted worldwide. Most patients died within weeks or months, but a few survived. And those survivors proved that with the right drugs, the right surgical techniques, and the right post-operative care, you could replace a person's heart, and they could live. Not just survive, but actually live. Go home, return to work, spend time with their families. Organ transplantation created a medical and ethical revolution. Suddenly doctors had to define death in entirely new ways. For all of human history, death meant your heart stopped beating. But now hearts could be restarted, even replaced. The concept of brain death emerged in the late 1960s, the idea that a person could be legally dead even though their heart was still beating, if their brain had irreversibly ceased functioning. This wasn't just medical philosophy, it was practical necessity. The best organs for transplantation come from people who are brain dead, but whose hearts are still pumping, keeping the organ supplied with oxygenated blood until they can be harvested. Harvested. Even the language reveals how radical this transformation was. Human organs became transplantable resources, bodies became potential donors, death became an opportunity to save lives. By the year 2000, doctors were routinely transplanting kidneys, livers, hearts, lungs, pancreases, even faces. The impossible had become standard procedure. But while surgeons were physically replacing organs, other scientists were figuring out how to read and eventually rewrite the instruction manual that builds them. February 28, 1953, the Eagle Pub in Cambridge, England. Francis Crick walks in and announces to everyone present that he and James Watson have just discovered the secret of life. Most people in the pub probably thought he was drunk. He wasn't. He and Watson had just worked out the structure of DNA, deoxyribonucleic acid, the molecule that carries genetic information in every living cell. The double helix. 2 strands twisted around each other like a spiral staircase, with the rungs made of chemical bases that pair up in specific ways. Adenine always pairs with thymine. Guanine always pairs with cytosine. This wasn't just elegant biochemistry. This was the mechanism of heredity, the way traits pass from parents to children, the physical basis of evolution, the instruction set that builds and maintains every human body. Watson and Crick's discovery, built on the X-ray crystallography work of Rosalind Franklin and others, unlocked a cascade of understanding. Within a decade, scientists had cracked the genetic code, figuring out how sequences of DNA bases translate into the amino acid sequences that make up proteins. Within 2 decades, they could identify genes responsible for specific diseases. Within 3 decades, they were beginning to manipulate genetic sequences, adding, removing, or modifying genes in laboratory organisms. The implications for medicine were staggering. For the first time, doctors could diagnose diseases before symptoms appeared. A blood test could reveal whether you carried genes for cystic fibrosis, sickle cell anemia, Huntington's disease, or hundreds of other genetic conditions. Parents could know whether their unborn children would develop devastating genetic diseases. This raised as many ethical questions as it answered medical ones. What do you do with information about diseases that won't manifest for decades? Do you have a right not to know your genetic future? Should parents be able to select embryos based on genetic testing? These questions would become increasingly urgent as genetic medicine advanced. But in the immediate term, understanding DNA revolutionized how doctors understood disease. Cancer, which had mystified physicians for millennia, turned out to be fundamentally a genetic disease. Not necessarily inherited, but caused by mutations that damaged the genes controlling cell division. Heart disease, diabetes, Alzheimer's, all had genetic components that could be studied, understood, and eventually targeted with treatments. By the 1990s, an international consortium was working on the Human Genome Project, an effort to map every single gene in human DNA. The complete instruction manual for building a human being. When it was completed in 2003, just after our time period but launched well within it, it would contain 3 billion base pairs of data, the recipe for humanity. While scientists were learning to read the body's instruction manual, other researchers were learning to see inside the body without cutting it open. For all of medical history, the inside of a living human body had been a mystery. You could feel lumps, listen to heartbeats, observe symptoms, but you couldn't actually see what was happening inside without surgery. X-rays, discovered in 1895, had been revolutionary. Suddenly you could see bones, detect fractures, spot some tumours. But X-rays could only show dense structures. Soft tissues, organs, the brain, all remained invisible. Then in 1972, Godfrey Hounsfield and Alan Cormack developed computed tomography, the CT scan. The machine rotated an X-ray source around the patient's body, taking images from hundreds of different angles, then used computer algorithms to construct a three-dimensional image of the body's interior. For the first time in history, doctors could see a clear picture of the brain, heart, liver and kidneys without making a single incision. A patient would lie still for a few minutes while the machine hummed and whirred around them. Then, minutes later, doctors would have detailed cross-sectional images of their internal anatomy. Tumours that would have been undetectable until they caused symptoms could now be spotted when they were tiny and treatable. Internal bleeding could be located precisely. Strokes could be identified and categorised within minutes of a patient arriving at the emergency room, but CT scans still used radiation and weren't great at distinguishing between different types of soft tissue. Enter magnetic resonance imaging, MRI. Developed in the 1970s and becoming widespread in the 1980s, MRI used powerful magnetic fields and radio waves to create even more detailed images. No radiation, better contrast between different tissue types, unprecedented ability to visualize the brain, spinal cord, and joints. The physics behind MRI is mind-bendingly complex, involving nuclear magnetic resonance, quantum mechanical spin states, and carefully controlled magnetic field gradients. But the practical result was simple. Doctors could see inside living bodies with a clarity that would have seemed like science fiction just decades earlier. Then came PET scans, positron emission tomography, which could visualize not just structure but function. By injecting patients with radioactive tracers that concentrated in metabolically active tissue, doctors could watch the brain thinking, identify which parts of tumours were growing most aggressively, and detect cancer metastases throughout the entire body in a single scan. The invisible had become visible, but perhaps no single medical development transformed society as profoundly as a simple pill. May 9, 1960. The FDA approved the first oral contraceptive, Enovid, the birth control pill. On the surface, this was just another pharmaceutical development, synthetic hormones that prevented ovulation, simple biochemistry really. But the social implications were seismic. For all of human history, sex and reproduction had been inextricably linked. Women's lives had been shaped by this biological reality. Puberty meant beginning a cycle of pregnancy, childbirth, and child-rearing that would dominate their adult lives. Women had children because that's what happened when you had sex. They had as many children as biology provided. Some societies had developed contraceptive methods, from ancient Egyptian pessaries to condoms made of animal intestines. But nothing was reliable. Nothing gave women true reproductive control. The pill changed everything. For the first time, women could reliably separate sex from reproduction. They could choose when and whether to have children. They could pursue education and careers without the constant threat of unplanned pregnancy derailing their plans. They could control their own fertility with the same simple daily routine as taking a vitamin. The social transformation happened remarkably quickly. Women's college enrollment surged. Career opportunities expanded. The average age of first marriage rose. Birth rates declined. None of this was universally welcomed. Religious leaders condemned the pill as an assault on traditional family structures. Some doctors refused to prescribe it. Many pharmacies wouldn't stock it. In the United States, it wasn't even legal to provide contraceptives to unmarried women in all states until a 1972 Supreme Court decision. But the resistance couldn't stop the transformation. By 1965, 1 in 4 married women in the United States was using the pill. By 1973, millions worldwide were taking it. The pill wasn't just medicine. It was social revolution in pharmaceutical form. It gave women something they'd never had before, genuine autonomy over their reproductive lives. And once that power was granted, there was no taking it back. But medicine's triumphant march forward hit a terrifying obstacle in the early 1980s. June 5, 1981. the CDC published a report about 5 previously healthy gay men in Los Angeles who had developed a rare type of pneumonia. All 5 had severely compromised immune systems for no apparent reason. 2 had already died. Over the following months, more cases appeared, then dozens, then hundreds. Young, previously healthy people, mostly gay, men but increasingly intravenous drug users and haemophiliacs, were dying of infections that healthy immune systems easily fought off. Something was destroying their immune systems, but nobody knew what. The medical community called it GRID, gay-related immune deficiency. The media called it the gay plague. The public panicked. Could you catch it from toilet seats? From kissing? From being near someone who had it? Nobody knew. And because it initially affected stigmatized populations, the government response was catastrophic slow. Research funding was minimal. Public health campaigns were non-existent. Patients were treated like pariahs, refused service by doctors, evicted from apartments, fired from jobs. Some died alone in hospital rooms that medical staff would enter only in full protective gear. The death toll mounted. 1982, 500 deaths in the US. 1985, 8,000 deaths. 1990, 120,000 cumulative deaths. Young men were dying in their 20s and 30s, their bodies ravaged by opportunistic infections and rare cancers. The disease had been renamed AIDS, acquired immunodeficiency syndrome, and by 1983 researchers had identified the cause. A retrovirus that infected and destroyed the immune system's T cells. A HIV, human immunodeficiency virus. It spread through blood and sexual contact. But knowing the cause didn't mean doctors could treat it. Throughout the 1980s, an HIV diagnosis was a death sentence. You might live 2 years, maybe 5 if you were lucky. But eventually the virus would destroy your immune system completely, and some infection, pneumocystis pneumonia, toxoplasmosis, Kaposi's sarcoma, would kill you. Then, slowly, progress. In 1987, AZT became the first drug approved to treat HIV. It didn't cure the disease, but it slowed the virus's replication, giving patients a few more months or years. Through the 1990s, more drugs were developed, each targeting different parts of the virus's life cycle. The breakthrough came with highly active antiretroviral therapy, HAART, cocktails of multiple drugs that could suppress the virus so effectively that it became undetectable in patients' blood. People who would have died started living, not just surviving on their deathbeds, but actually living normal lifespans, working, having relationships. By the late 1990s, HIV had transformed from a death sentence to a manageable chronic condition, at least for people with access to treatment. The AIDS crisis taught medicine crucial lessons about emerging diseases, about the importance of funding research for stigmatized populations, and about how social factors shape medical outcomes. It also demonstrated something profound about medical research. When resources and attention finally focused on a problem, progress could be shockingly fast. That same pattern played out with cancer. For most of medical history, cancer had been a death sentence. Surgery could remove isolated tumours if caught early, but any cancer that had spread was untreatable. The disease was fundamentally mysterious. Why did cells suddenly start dividing uncontrollably? Why did cancer spread? Why did some cancers respond to treatments while others didn't? Through the post-war period, understanding grew, and with it treatment options. Radiation therapy improved, with better targeting and fewer side effects. Chemotherapy, discovered almost by accident when scientists noticed that mustard gas destroyed fast-growing cells, became increasingly sophisticated. Different drugs targeted different aspects of cell division. Cocktails of multiple chemotherapy agents could attack cancer on multiple fronts simultaneously. But the treatments were brutal. Chemotherapy couldn't distinguish between cancerous cells and other fast-growing cells like those in hair follicles, digestive tract linings, and bone marrow. Patients lost their hair, suffered terrible nausea, and became vulnerable to infections as their immune systems were decimated. The question was always whether the treatment would kill the cancer before it killed the patient. By the 1980s and 90s, treatments were becoming more targeted. Researchers were identifying specific molecules on cancer cells that could be targeted with designer drugs. Tamoxifen for breast cancer blocked estrogen receptors. Gleevec for chronic myeloid leukemia targeted a specific protein produced by a genetic mutation. These weren't chemotherapy in the traditional sense. They were targeted therapies designed to kill cancer cells while leaving normal cells relatively unharmed. Cancer survival rates began a steady climb. 5-year survival for childhood leukemia went from 10% in the 1960s to 75% by the 1990s. Breast cancer 5-year survival rose from 63% to 85%. Colorectal cancer survival nearly doubled. Cancer was still terrifying, still deadly, but increasingly it was survivable. The transformation came from systematic research, carefully designed clinical trials that tested new treatments against existing ones, and rigorous statistical analysis of outcomes. This was evidence-based medicine in action, and evidence-based medicine was revolutionizing every aspect of healthcare. For most of medical history, treatments were based on tradition, theory, and individual doctors' experiences. Some doctor somewhere tried something, thought it worked, and taught his students to use the same treatment. Sometimes this worked well, often it didn't. Treatments that were useless or actively harmful persisted for centuries because nobody systematically tested whether they actually worked. The randomized controlled trial changed everything. Instead of assuming a treatment worked based on tradition or theory, you tested it. You randomly assigned patients to receive either the new treatment or the current standard of care, then tracked outcomes. If the new treatment produced better results, you adopted it. If not, you discarded it. Simple in concept, revolutionary in practice. By the 1970s and 80s, randomized trials were becoming the gold standard for evaluating medical treatments. Meta-analyses that combined data from multiple trials could identify small effects that individual studies might miss. Systematic reviews evaluated all the evidence for specific treatments, separating genuine benefits from statistical noise. Professional medical organizations began issuing evidence-based guidelines for treating everything from heart attacks to depression. Treatments were standardized based on what actually worked rather than what doctors thought should work. The result was dramatic improvement in outcomes. Survival rates for heart attacks doubled, then doubled again, as evidence-based treatments, clot-busting drugs, aspirin, beta blockers became standard. Surgical outcomes improved as studies identified best practices for everything, from anesthesia to post-operative care. Even diseases without cures became more manageable as evidence accumulated about which treatments provided the best quality of life. Medicine was becoming a science in the truest sense. Hypothesis testing, data collection, peer review, gradual accumulation of reliable knowledge. Not the heroic individual physician relying on intuition and experience, but collaborative networks of researchers systematically testing interventions and sharing results. By the year 2000, medicine had been transformed. Diseases that had killed millions were rare or eradicated. Organs could be transplanted. The genetic basis of disease was understood. The body's interior could be visualized in real time. Women controlled their fertility. HIV was manageable. Cancer was increasingly survivable. And systematic evidence determined treatment. But the greatest revolution was still ahead, waiting in strings of ones and zeros in the digital networks that were just beginning to connect the world. What happened next would make everything that came before seem like a prelude. Picture this, it's February 2001, and scientists are standing in front of television cameras about to announce something that would have seemed like absolute fantasy just 50 years earlier. They've done it. They've mapped the entire human genome, all 3 billion base pairs, every gene, Every instruction written into our DNA over hundreds of thousands of years of evolution. The complete blueprint of what makes a human being human. But here's the thing. Nobody really understood what they were looking at. Sure, they had the map. They could point to specific genes and say, this one codes for eye colour, or this one is associated with certain diseases. But the genome wasn't like a simple instruction manual. It was more like finding a library containing every book ever written about how to build and maintain a human body, except the books were written in a language nobody fully understood, with no index, no chapter headings, and half the pages appearing to be complete. Nonsense. Those junk DNA sections, turns out they weren't junk at all. They were regulatory elements, switches that turned other genes on and off, evolutionary remnants that still played crucial roles. The genome was revealing itself to be far more complex and beautiful than anyone had imagined. But even with all that complexity, the promise was intoxicating. Personalized medicine. That was the dream. Instead of giving everyone the same drug and hoping it worked, doctors would analyze your specific genetic makeup and prescribe treatments designed exactly for you. Your cancer would get medicine tailored to its unique genetic signature. Your depression would be treated with drugs matched to your brain chemistry. Your heart disease would be prevented decades before it started because doctors would see it written in your genes. 20 years later, we're getting there. Slowly, very slowly, but we're getting there. Cancer treatments are increasingly personalized based on the tumor's genetic profile. Pharmacogenomics is helping doctors understand why some people respond to certain drugs while others don't. Genetic screening can identify risks for hundreds of diseases before symptoms ever appear. The problem is, biology doesn't care about our timelines. Every answer revealed 10 new questions. Every gene we understood showed us 100 more connections we didn't. The human body turned out to be vastly more complicated than the genome map could capture. And then, in 2012, two scientists changed everything again. Jennifer Doudna and Emmanuel Charpentier published a paper describing a system they called CRISPR. Most people had never heard of it. Within 5 years, it would revolutionize biology. Within 10, it would win them the Nobel Prize. Here's what CRISPR does. Remember how we said the genome was like a library? Well, CRISPR is like having molecular scissors that can cut out specific sentences, replace them with new ones, or delete them entirely. Except these scissors are precise down to individual letters, and they work in living cells, in living humans. The implications hit like a lightning bolt. Genetic diseases that had been death sentences for thousands of years could potentially be cured. Just edit out the broken gene, replace it with a working one, done. Sickle cell disease, fixed. Huntington's, gone. Muscular dystrophy, cured. Cystic fibrosis, history. And it's actually happening. In 2023, the first CRISPR treatment was approved for sickle cell disease. Patients who had lived with excruciating pain their entire lives were walking out of hospitals cured. Not treated. Cured. Their DNA had been rewritten. The disease was gone. But here's where things get complicated. Because CRISPR doesn't just work on disease genes. It works on any genes. Height genes, intelligence genes, eye color, athletic ability, disease resistance. You could, theoretically, design your children. Pick and choose traits like ordering from a menu. This isn't science fiction anymore. This is technology that exists right now, sitting in laboratories, waiting for someone to decide how far is too far. China already crossed one line. In 2018, a scientist named He Jiankui used CRISPR to edit human embryos, creating the world's first gene-edited babies. The international scientific community responded with horror and condemnation. He went to prison. But the babies are still out there, growing up with edited genomes that will be passed to their children and their children's children. The genie doesn't go back in the bottle. We're standing at the edge of something unprecedented. For the first time in 300,000 years of human history, we can intentionally edit our own evolution. We can become the sculptors of our own genome. The question isn't whether we can do it. The question is whether we should, and who gets to decide. But gene editing isn't even the most exciting thing happening in medicine right now. While scientists were learning to rewrite DNA, other researchers were discovering something equally revolutionary. They were teaching the immune system to hunt cancer. Cancer has always been medicine's white whale. We've tried everything: surgery, radiation, chemotherapy, targeted drugs. Some work better than others, some buy time, some even cure. But cancer is tricky. It's not an invader from outside. It's your own cells gone rogue, which means your immune system often can't tell the difference between cancer and healthy tissue. Until now. CAR T-cell therapy takes your own immune cells out of your body, genetically engineers them to recognize and attack your specific cancer, multiplies them into armies of millions, then puts them back in. These reprogrammed cells are like assassins with your cancer's photograph. They hunt it down systematically, cell by cell, until it's gone. The results have been staggering. Patients with leukemia who were given months to live are now cancer-free 5-10 years later. Children who had exhausted every other treatment option are playing soccer again. This isn't incremental improvement. This is people who were supposed to die walking out of hospitals cured, but it's not perfect. The therapy is incredibly expensive, hundreds of thousands of dollars per patient. It doesn't work for everyone. Sometimes the engineered immune cells attack healthy tissue, causing dangerous side effects. And it only works for certain types of cancer so far. Blood cancers mostly. Solid tumours are proving much harder. Still, the trajectory is clear. We're not just fighting cancer anymore. We're turning the body's own defences into precision weapons. We're making cancer into something the immune system can see and destroy. Every year the therapies get better, work for more cancer types, cause fewer side effects. Every year more people survive. And while all this is happening, something even stranger is emerging. Artificial intelligence is becoming better at reading medical images than human doctors. Think about what that means. A human radiologist trains for years to learn how to spot cancer on an X-ray or MRI. They look at thousands of images, developing intuition for what normal looks like and what dangerous looks like. They're good at it. Really good. But they're still human. They get tired. They have bad days. They miss things. An AI doesn't have bad days. It doesn't get tired after reading 100 scans. And it's been trained on millions of images, orders of magnitude more than any human could see in a lifetime. When it looks at a chest X-ray, it's comparing it against every other chest X-ray in its training database simultaneously, finding patterns invisible to human eyes. The results are remarkable and slightly disturbing. AI systems are now detecting lung cancer on CT scans more accurately than expert radiologists. They're identifying diabetic retinopathy from eye photos. They're predicting heart attacks from routine EKGs. They're diagnosing skin cancer from smartphone photos as accurately as dermatologists with decades of experience. This isn't replacing doctors, not yet, but it's changing what doctors do. Instead of spending hours looking at scans, they're reviewing AI findings and focusing on the cases that need human judgment. Instead of missing subtle early signs of disease, they're catching cancers months or years earlier when they're still treatable. The AI handles pattern recognition. Humans handle the complex decision-making, and it's not just diagnosis. AI is designing new drugs, predicting which medications will work for which patients, even suggesting treatment plans based on thousands of similar cases. In 2020, when COVID-19 hit, AI systems helped identify potential treatments by analysing millions of compounds in weeks, work that would have taken human researchers years. But perhaps the most revolutionary change isn't happening in hospitals at all. It's happening in your pocket. Your smartphone has more medical monitoring capability than a hospital intensive care unit had 30 years ago, and it's connected to the entire world's medical knowledge through the internet. Telemedicine went from niche curiosity to mainstream necessity, basically overnight during the COVID pandemic. Suddenly, Millions of people were seeing doctors through video calls, getting prescriptions without leaving home, monitoring chronic conditions with apps and wearable sensors. The result? Healthcare that had required physical presence for thousands of years was suddenly available to anyone with an internet connection. Rural communities with no local doctors got access to specialists hundreds of miles away. Elderly patients with mobility issues could get care without travelling. People in developing countries could consult with experts in wealthy nations. Geography stopped being a barrier to healthcare, at least partially. Your smartwatch is monitoring your heart rhythm continuously, alerting you to arrhythmias before you feel symptoms. Apps are tracking your blood sugar, blood pressure, sleep quality, activity levels. Your phone's camera can check for skin cancer. AI chatbots can provide preliminary diagnosis and medical advice 24/7. We're carrying Star Trek tricorders in our pockets and barely noticing. But this creates new problems. Digital divides leaving poor and elderly populations behind. Privacy concerns about who has access to your continuous health data. The challenge of separating good medical information from dangerous misinformation online. Technology is democratizing healthcare access, while simultaneously creating new forms of inequality. Meanwhile, in laboratories around the world, scientists are building organs, actual human organs, from scratch, using 3D printers. It sounds impossible, but it's happening. Researchers have successfully printed skin, bone, cartilage, even blood vessels. They're working on livers, kidneys, hearts. The process is remarkable. Start with a patient's own cells, grow them in the lab, combine them with specialized bioinks, then print them layer by layer following a digital blueprint. The result is living tissue that's genetically identical to the patient, meaning zero risk of rejection. We're not there yet. The organs being printed now are simple structures for research, but the progress is accelerating. Within a decade, we might have printed organs ready for transplant. Within 2, organ shortage could be history. Instead of waiting years for a donor kidney, you'd just print one using your own cells. No waiting lists. No anti-rejection drugs. No hoping someone else's tragedy gives you a second chance at life. The implications extend beyond transplants. Printed tissue is letting researchers test new drugs on actual human organs without risking patients. They're studying diseases in lab-grown tissue that perfectly matches the patient. They're creating models of conditions that were impossible to study before. We're moving from treating disease to understanding it at a level that was unimaginable 20 years ago. And then there's the microbiome, the trillions of bacteria, viruses and fungi living in and on your body right now. We used to think of them as passengers, harmless hitchhikers, maybe occasionally causing infections, but mostly irrelevant to health. We were spectacularly wrong. Your microbiome isn't just along for the ride, it's actively controlling huge aspects of your health. Gut bacteria are manufacturing vitamins, training your immune system, even producing neurotransmitters that affect your mood and behavior. The composition of your microbiome influences your risk for obesity, diabetes, depression, autoimmune diseases, possibly even conditions like autism and Alzheimer's. We're not just human, we're ecosystems, walking colonies containing more bacterial cells than human cells, and those bacteria have enormous power over our health and behavior. Disturb the ecosystem through antibiotics, poor diet or chronic stress, and diseases emerge. Restore balance, and health returns. This is spawning entirely new approaches to medicine. Fecal microbiota transplants, which are exactly what they sound like, are curing life-threatening intestinal infections that resisted all antibiotics. Probiotic treatments are showing promise for everything from anxiety to inflammatory bowel disease. Scientists are identifying specific bacterial strains that protect against disease and engineering new probiotics to prevent illness before it starts. We're learning that health isn't just about human cells functioning properly. It's about maintaining the complex ecosystem that is a human body, including the trillions of microscopic organisms that call us home. But for all these advances, for all the diseases we've cured and mysteries we've solved, enormous questions remain unanswered. We still don't really understand consciousness. How does 3 pounds of wet biological tissue create the subjective experience of being you? We can map the brain, identify regions associated with different functions, even record individual neurons firing. But we can't explain how any of that produces the inner sense of awareness, the feeling of existing. We still can't reverse aging. We've extended lifespans dramatically, but we can't stop the fundamental process that makes cells deteriorate and die. We don't even fully understand why we age. Is it programmed obsolescence, evolutionary selected because death makes room for new generations? Or is it just accumulated damage, wear and tear that could theoretically be repaired? And if we could reverse aging, should we? What happens to society when people live for centuries? We still can't predict or prevent pandemics. COVID-19 showed us that despite all our technology, all our medical advances, a novel virus can still shut down civilization. We're better prepared now than we were in 1918, but we're also more connected, more urbanized, more vulnerable to rapid disease spread. The next pandemic could come from anywhere, anytime, and we're in a race between our ability to develop treatments and the virus's ability to evolve resistance. Medicine has come so far, from trepanation to CRISPR, from herbal remedies to engineered immune cells, from shamanic healing to AI diagnosis. We've extended human lifespan by decades. We've conquered diseases that killed millions. We've developed tools that would seem like magic to physicians just a century ago. But we're also facing challenges unprecedented in human history. Gene editing, raising questions we barely know how to ask. AI changing the fundamental nature of medical practice. Technology creating new inequalities even as it solves old problems. And through it all, the basic human drive that's propelled medicine for 300,000 years remains unchanged. The desperate need to heal, to ease suffering, to keep death at bay for one more day, one more year, one more lifetime. We're standing at the threshold. Behind us 300,000 years of human healing, from desperate prehistoric surgery to the miracles of modern medicine. Ahead of us, possibilities that would have seemed impossible just decades ago. The cure for aging, the end of genetic disease, the conquest of cancer, maybe even the solution to consciousness itself. We don't know what the next chapter holds, but if history teaches us anything, it's this. Humans will keep trying, keep experimenting, keep pushing against the boundaries of what's possible, because that's what we've always done. That's what kept us alive through ice ages and bottlenecks and plagues. That's what turned frightened primates into the species that rewrites its own DNA and teaches its immune system to hunt cancer. The eternal quest to heal continues, and we're just getting started. So here we are, 300,000 years after a Neanderthal elder carefully positioned willow bark on an infected wound. 5,000 years after Sumerian physicians first wrote down their healing formulas. 2,500 years after Hippocrates declared that diseases had natural causes, not divine punishment. 500 years after Vesalius cut open cadavers to reveal the actual architecture of the human body. 150 years after Lister proved that invisible microbes were killing surgical patients. 80 years after Fleming discovered that bread mold could stop infections that had killed millions. 50 years after the first heart transplant. 25 years after we decoded the entire human genome. And we're still trying to figure out how to keep each other alive. That's the central paradox of medicine's entire history. We've made progress that would seem like divine intervention to our ancestors. We've eliminated diseases that once killed half of all children before their 5th birthday. We've learned to transplant organs, edit genes, print living tissue, cure cancers that were death sentences just decades ago. We've extended human lifespan by decades in most of the world, centuries in some places compared to our prehistoric ancestors. But we still get sick, we still age, we still die. Every single person who's ever lived has eventually failed to keep living. Every medical breakthrough just moves the goalpost, reveals new frontiers of suffering we didn't even know existed. We cure smallpox and discover Alzheimer's. We master bacterial infections and face antibiotic resistance. We decode the genome and realize how terrifyingly complex gene interactions actually are. This isn't a failure, it's the engine. The fact that death remains inevitable is precisely what's driven 300,000 years of relentless innovation. Every healer in history, from that first Neanderthal who figured out certain plants reduced pain, to the researchers right now working on CRISPR therapies and artificial organs, they're all driven by the same fundamental human instinct. When someone we care about is suffering, we refuse to accept it. We try something, anything. We experiment, we fail, we try again. That's the continuous thread running through this entire story. Not the technologies, not the theories, not even the discoveries. It's the compassion, the unwillingness to watch suffering and do nothing. That Neanderthal healer and the modern genetic engineer are separated by 300,000 years and technologies that would seem like magic. But they're driven by exactly the same impulse. Someone is hurting, I need to help. And here's what's changed most dramatically in just the last few decades. That knowledge, those healing techniques that were once guarded secrets passed from master to apprentice, reserved for priests and elite physicians, accessible only to the wealthy and powerful, they're now available to billions. You can access more medical information on your phone right now than existed in all the libraries of ancient Alexandria. A farmer in rural India can watch a surgical technique being performed at Johns Hopkins. A student in Lagos can study the same genetics textbook as someone at Oxford. The democratization of medical knowledge is accelerating faster than at any point in human history. And it's creating healers in places and ways we never imagined. Citizen scientists discovering new drug interactions. Patient communities sharing treatment experiences faster than academic journals can publish. Open source medical devices being 3D printed in resource-poor areas. We're all part of this story now. Every time you make a healthcare decision, share medical information, support research, or simply refuse to accept that suffering is inevitable, you're continuing a quest that started when our ancestors were still sharing the world with multiple human species. So here's what I want you to do. First, if this journey through 300,000 years of human healing sparked something in you, hit that like button. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from, because this is a global story, and I want to see how far it's reaching. Subscribe if you want more deep dives into the forces that shaped human history, because we're just getting started. And if you really want to support this channel and get some extras, there's a membership option that helps me keep making these deep explorations into human history. But most importantly, remember this. Every medical breakthrough you've heard about today, from herbal remedies to gene editing, started the same way, with someone looking at suffering and refusing to accept it as inevitable. That impulse hasn't changed in 300,000 years, and as long as humans exist, it never will. The quest continues, and we're all part of it.